How
are
are you been?
How are you?
Fine. How are things?
Well, I guess things are the same for all of us right now.
Yeah, but Delhi, has been pretty bad. It's been a terrible.
Sorry to interrupt, sir. We are already live.
Okay.
I'm really sorry. Yes.
No problem.
No, we'll talk it.
Yes.
Namaste and good evening, everyone. I, Ritika Gupta, Assistant Director at IMPRI, Impact and Policy Research Institute, Prabhav Evam Niti, Anusandhan Sansthan, extend my heartiest welcome to you all to IMPRI #Web Policy Talk. Today, we are here for a book discussion on the Shudras, the vision for a new path. This lecture is part of the series, The State of Human Dignity and Development, #Inclusive Development, which is organized by Center for Human Dignity and Development at IMPRI and Counterview. I request Dr. C.B. Mehta, who is CEO and Editorial Director at IMPRI, to introduce our eminent panelists and speakers and the program further. Ma'am, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ritika. Good evening to everyone, and I welcome you this evening. At IMPRI, we sincerely wish the best of health for you and your loved ones and everyone around you. In continuation with our celebrations of Dr. Babasaheb Bhimrao Ambedkar's birth anniversary month, we are privileged to be hosting a power-packed event this evening with globally renowned scholars. We have witnessed attempts to undermine the contributions of the Shudra revolutionary movements, which is also often been taken for granted. But the works like the book, The Shudras, Vision for a New Path, under the leadership of great minds like Professor Kancha Ilaiah Shefford, Professor Sukhadeo Thorat, Professor Akash Singh Rathore, Dr. Ajay Gudavarti, and Dr. Arvind Kumar, are esteemed panelists for the evening, and millions of intellectual revolutionaries around the world, each working to shoulder the fundamental values of the dignity of the individual and the unity of the nation, that we see hope of a radically egalitarian justice, equitable access to a better life, and equal partnership in the nation's growth. The book, a bestseller, makes a contribution to not just the scholarship in the study of the enormous contributions of the Shudras in the nation-building process, but provides a rich tribute to the great Phules, Mahatma Jyoti Rao and Savitribai, who initiated the Shudra revolutionary movement of read, write, and fight for the first time in Indian history. I am honored to introduce our eminent panelists. Professor Sukhadeo Thorat, the chair of the program. He is an eminent economist, recipient of the prestigious Padma Shri by the Government of India, chairperson of Indian Institute of Dalit Studies, former chairperson of University Grants Commission, and also of Indian Council of Social Science Research, and is a distinguished professor at Savitribai Phule University. Welcome, sir. As the speakers of the book, we have with us Professor Kancha Ilaiah Shefford, the co-editor of the book, The Shudras, Vision for a New Path. He is an Indian political theorist of international acclaim, a prolific writer, Dalit rights activist, and the former director of the Center for the Study of Social Exclusion and Inclusive Policy at Maulana Azad National Urdu University, Hyderabad. We are joined by Dr. Arvind Kumar, who is Assistant Professor, Center for the Study of Social Exclusion and Inclusive Policy at Jamia Milia Islamia, New Delhi. He is the author of the first chapter in the book and is titled The Nation and its Shudras. Welcome, sir. To discuss the book, we are also joined by Professor Akash Singh Rathore, the editor of the book series Rethinking India, which is published by Penguin India and Vintage, and the current book under discussion is fifth of the series. Professor Rathore is Professor of Politics, Philosophy, and Law at LUISS University, Rome. He is a philosopher, author, and an Ironman triathlete. We have with us Dr. Ajay Gudavarti, Associate Professor of Political Science at the Center for Political Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. He is the author of several books, research articles, media commentaries, including the best-selling book, India After Modi, Populism and the Right, which is published by Bloomsbury. With this, I once again welcome all of you and all the participants here on Zoom and Facebook Live. I now invite Professor Thorat to take the floor and lead the discussion. Over to you, sir.
So please unmute yourself.
Yes, sir is unmuted.
Voice.
Professor Thorat, are you able to hear me?
Speak.
Sir,
Hello?
could you please- Yes, sir.
Hello?
Yes, you're audible. Yes.
Okay, I'm supposed to make the opening
Yes, sir.
remark, and
Yes, sir.
then at the end I'll come.
Yes, sir.
My video is not working, and it seems to me that there is a break after every 2 minutes or 1 minute. So I'll try to be very slow. Yeah. Well, I think we should begin with a congratulations to Professor Kancha Ilaiah and Karthik Raja for bringing out this timely book on Shudra. The Shudras are holding the fort now, so we'll be quite interested to have a discussion on this book. Kancha Ilaiah has been writing on this theme for several years, right from the beginning, and he has brought so much of insight on the issue of Shudra and its interlinkages with Dalit. We have a very interesting panel here, and so we would be interested to listen to the book and on the issue. Therefore, I ask Simi Mehta to continue the discussion.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much, Professor Sukhadeo Thorat, for your opening remarks. And with this, I invite Professor Kancha Ilaiah Shepherd for his opening remarks. Sir, back over to you.
Thank you very much for this evening discussion on the book. I'm glad that Professor Thorat is chairing this discussion, and the center has taken the trouble to organize this discussion at a time when we are all in a crisis of pandemic. Now, before I say a few things about the book, can I ask Akash to just quickly introduce the Samruddh Bharat Foundation and the volumes that they are bringing out, which is part of this, because it is part of Rethinking India series, what it means quickly. Can you, Akash, briefly say a few things about it?
Professor, I was going to say those things in my remarks when
Okay, fine. If that is so, this book would not have been possible with this title if there was no RSS BJP in power today in the form that it is. And some of us have seen the developments over a period of time, how certain forces came to control the entire political structure, economic structure, spiritual structure, and RSS BJP are in the center of that control. So, way back in 2018, I wrote an essay, Where Are the Shudras after BJP came to power? You all know that the famous book of Ambedkar, which was perhaps the earliest book in India, where were the Shudras? He looked at the Shudra status in Sanskrit literature mostly, and defined them as the literature portrayed them. Thereafter, not much has been done, but today, I must give a small clarification about the title. There was a strong opinion that the book title should be OBC, but I was not willing for that, because today the OBC category includes the present Prime Minister as well, who doesn't come from a Shudra background. So then in North India, the Vaishya community somehow managed OBC status. And also there are Muslims within the OBC category. So if we were to put a title of OBC, the historical Shudras and the present Shudras would not have been reflected in the book as they are. In fact, several non-reserved Shudras would have been avoided, who are in the main forefront of the farmer struggle. Now, the question of contemporary definition of Shudras, how do we define, and how does this book create a binary with the present BJP, RSS ruling, controlling, hegemonic forces? In the last chapter of the book, Caste and Political Economy, in the first para, we have said this. In economic terms, Shudras are historically known as agriculturalists, artisans, and cattle rearers. Broadly, they are known as farming community. All interconnected production-related work was done by Shudras in the fields and the Dvijas. Now, we have defined the Dvijas altogether in a new combination. Brahmins, Banyas, Kayasthas never had a role in labor-related work in the production process. Brahmin, Banyas, and Kshatriyas there. We characterize all Dvijas, including Khatris and Kayasthas, along with Brahmins, Banyas, and Kshatriyas, as the Bhadralok or Dvija. They hardly have a role in national agrarian wealth production, whether feudal or pre-feudal. Now, this pre-feudal, we have included the 1500 years period between building of Harappan city and writing of Rigveda, or what we call the Aryan economic, social, philosophical structures getting settled. And it was the Shudras who built the Harappan villages, Harappan agriculture, Harappan cities, Harappan. So without a book, they did that civilizational building. So the intellectual legitimacy for such non-participation was achieved through Brahminic texts, which characterized any field based on manual labor work in a negative sense. Hence, production was treated as pollution in the Brahminic economic worldview. Now, this is an economic definition of the present Shudras, in which Jats, Gujars, Patels, Maratha, Kamma, Reddy, all of them include as agricultural communities. But there is also a spiritual definition, which comes in several other chapters. The spiritual definition is historical right from the Rigvedic period, but even Ambedkar pinned down that spiritual definition, that the Shudras became Shudras because they were denied of the sacred thread, Janev. And the sacred thread denial has a definite direction of controlling the god, not allowing them to become priests. Earlier, Sanskrit, even in the Muslim period, they did not get Persian education. For what reasons, we do not know. We have to research. But now they are also by and large away from English, which is not their spiritual language, but their power language, which they control. And there is also the whole question of linguistic formation. Sanskrit denial, then Persian not getting into their fold, and then English not coming. Thereby, politically, we have seen that from 1947 to today, no single Shudra leader became a national leader. With a prime minister candidate stature from Delhi. There were two prime ministers in between in a coalition parts, Charan Singh and Deva Gowda. They were pulled down within 6 months, and they had not carried any weight in Delhi administration. So therefore, we deliberately are not including Modi in this. There was a big difficult thing for us is the legal cell of the Penguin in defining his caste location, but we overcame that somehow. Now, what is the whole strategy of the book? The strategy of the book is that RSS, BJP are political forces, but they came into politics through Hindu religious structure. That the Brahmin, Baniya, Kayastha, Khatris, who structured their philosophy right from the beginning of 1925 to now, have not given any space to Shudra leadership in RSS structure. Never a such. Secondly, no Shudra has written any text upholding their theory, nor contributed to their theoretical formulation. Thirdly, they became the muzzle power of the Brahmin, Banya, Kayastha, Dvija strategy of regaining the whole nation, even from the so-called secular liberal Congress domain, as a muzzle power against the minorities, mainly Muslims and Christians, not so much against Sikhs. So, having used them, they came to power. Now today, they are almost non-existent in Delhi power. On the economic front, we have shown in the last chapter, which is written by a team of us, that in top 100 industries and in top 25 monopoly houses, whichever you count, there is no single Shudra monopoly house owner. So the Shudras are 52%. We have defined this based on 31 census and Mandal Commission recommendation, but now they could be roughly 55. And the Dvijas constitute roughly 7%. All five of them, Kshatriyas, Brahmin, Banya, Kayastha. Now down below the Shudras, Dalits are there, 18.5%, then Adivasis. Now without Shudras, RSS BJP cannot remain in power. But why Shudras lent all their support without money power, without political hegemony, without political control, and now they are building temples, organizing rituals, and culturally they are deploying the whole discourse on universities from Vedic period. In this deployment of literary history of Brahmanism, Shudras do not exist anywhere in future syllabuses. Earlier, they were not talked about in the universities in the name of secularism, anti-colonialism, post-colonialism. They never were recognized as a category. The Dalits fought through only after 1990, more significantly. Adivasis had a space because of their separate location, but Shudras have lost as a category. And of course, Shudras as of now are divided into two categories, reserved Shudras and the unreserved Shudras. The unreserved Shudras thought that they would become Kshatriyas, but now the RSS BJP government has shown, no. If the present formation continues, the Brahmin, Banya, Kayastha, Khatri, intellectual, political, economic, hegemony and with the 3 new formulas, which did not figure in our book so much, they would be reduced to the classical form, and they will be used very effectively again as the Dalits at the ground by the same forces. Because one historical fact we must remember is Ambedkar categorically argued that untouchability and Dalits, as Dalits have come into being, while the Brahminic forces were eliminating Buddhism. But the Shudras as a category in which Dalits were part was not only from Vedic period onwards, they were slaves at that time, and cattle rearers and the what we call pastoral economy builders. The Brahmin Banya Kayasthas were mere consumers at that time. But more than that, they were the builders of the whole Harappan agricultural civilization, which was far ahead of China by then, even Israel by then, and Egypt by then. So they lost out, they did not gain. And if Hindu Rashtra is established, I very seriously disagreed with Akash Patel book, who himself is a Shudra, who wrote a book very recently, Our Hindu Rashtra. He thinks that Hindu Rashtra will not come now because there is no Kshatriya to rule, or there is no single Brahmin after Ambedkar's constitution came. But the Shudra non-intellectual, non-modernist approach has put them in the present form because there were 315 princely states. And no princely state ruler sent their children to England to study. And the Baroda king who sent Ambedkar with a scholarship, I don't know why he gave in the beginning, but when he came back after 1917, gave him a job, but when the head priest suggested that he should not give him a house, he did not give him a house. So he had to go back to. So all Shudra kings were the slaves of the Brahmin head priest and prime minister. And Shudras even now are in that status. So they are not there in central universities, whether reserved or unreserved. They are not there in IITs, IIMs. They are not there in ambassador positions. They are not there in any hegemonic position. And of course, their position from early Congress to now is completely down. There are some regional parties with the Shudras, but the BJP is trying to dismantle them through the present control of economy of the Bania capital, monopoly capital. So it is with this, the book suggests that Shudras should own their Shudra identity and begin a battle with the Hindutva structures for equal rights in every sphere. And more so, get into English education, which is their property now, as Sanskrit was, and then see that their share of 52, whether reservation or no reservation, whether privatization or no privatization, has to be taken over, including in the temple. What is RSS stand? Will they accept? Did RSS declare that Geneva is not the yardstick for defining the Varnas? Nowhere. Did they say that Shudra can become priest? Nowhere. Would they have agreed Narendra Modi to be the prime minister if he were not to come from non-Shudra background? I was certainly sure he would not have, because the Bania economy is coming as a huge baggage to him from Gujarat. So no Shudra would have, even Sardar Patel would not have got that kind of a Bania economic support unless he comes from their own fold. So given this situation, this book tries to work out a vision for a path for the Shudras. which will certainly help the Dalits, because the violence need to be mitigated, and the friendly production relations must be re-established, because they work on land in various gradations, no doubt. And the Adivasis, we have not seriously gone into the minority question here, because we have posed 1 or 2 questions about their history also. Now, why Shudras also could not become Persian scholars, Urdu scholars, why Muslims did not write a single book on caste all through the history that they existed after Al-Biruni came and wrote and left in 30th century. So we set that aside. We are not willing to deal with that now. Once our issues are solved, the battle is fought with the RSS Hindutva. Because let us remember, before RSS, there is no central organization for Hinduism, whether of Shaivism or Vedic, or even whatever Arya Samaj or non-Arya Samaj or whatever Samaj. They were all small Brahminic functional groups. Today, RSS represents temple, RSS represents wealth, RSS represents political power, RSS represents medicinal values, cow urine. So all this has hit the Shudra 52% economy more, though it hit the Dalit economy, existence, philosophy. But Dalits are acquiring a philosophy through America. And the Shudras, the first Shudra book, in my view, written in Indian history, all other stories are bogus. It was Gulamgiri only. There was no Shudra book at all earlier. This is all bogus theory. So it is with this, we put the book before the whole nation, and particularly for Shudra, before Shudras, and they will have to, the young Shudras. And I am very happy that we decided to write the book only with the Shudra scholars. I could not get senior scholars. They did not want to identify with Shudraness. Therefore, I had to work with my young team, who are definitely, I hope, are the future. And let us see what happens in future. Thank you.
Thank you so
Yeah. Yeah, I concluded.
Yes, sir, some noise is coming.
Yeah, Kumar,
I
I
think
concluded.
Professor Sukhadeo Thorat's audio is not muted. So maybe that's why.
Yeah, but you ask other speakers, he will come back.
Yes. Yes,
Please
Arvind,
go.
please.
Please go ahead. Yeah. Hello. Please go ahead.
Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, sir. Yes. Mute. Okay.
Please invite the next speaker.
Yes, sir. So thank you so much, sir. Learned a lot, and thank you so much for your opening comments about the book. And yes, so can we have yes, Dr. Arvind Kumar for his remarks?
He will come later on, Simi. So we'll go to Akash sir now.
Okay. So can we have Professor Akash Singh Rathore, the book series editor, to share his remarks? So.
All right.
Yes, sir.
Thank you so much, and thanks to your team again for this invitation to be here. It's a great honor to share a platform with 2 of India's most important public intellectuals, Professor Kancha and Professor Thorat, and of course with the fellow panelists and friends, Arvind and Ajay. Just one minor comment, which is that our panel is something of a manual, and it would be nice if we had, we keep working on these issues, and it's always very difficult to find speakers and so on. But in this case, Prachi Patil has written a brilliant chapter on Bahujan women, and we should always try to ensure that we have some gender diversity on the. But that being said, I'm very happy to be here as part of it. So the Shudras Vision for a New Path is the 5th book of a series entitled Rethinking India. And this series is brought out, published by Penguin, but brought out by the Bharat Foundation. Now, I can't speak on behalf of the foundation, but what I will do is speak as a series editor for this series about what we're trying to do and where this volume fits in. So just over a year ago, we launched the series with the first book, Vision for a Nation. And this book was something of a normative platform of how to rethink our given realities, in some respects to broaden our imagination, because I'm sure I'm not alone amongst the attendees here in recognizing that the imagination of our political sphere, public sphere, is extremely, extremely constrained. There's not much sense of beyond realpolitik, infighting, jostling for power, about what India could be and ought to be. So what we do in the first volume of the series is to try to lay some foundation for imagining wider and imagining more deeply what the vision for our nation ought to be. And then we take off with volume 2, The Minority Conundrum, which really begins to unlock the mysteries of how we are to live in these majoritarian times. So how is it that a minority is not only to flourish, but even to survive in majoritarian times that we find ourselves in today? The third volume is on reviving jobs. And as we all know, as much as we like to boast about our occasionally booming economy, that boom has been and will continue to be for the foreseeable future a growth that is almost entirely jobless. And as long as growth remains jobless, income inequality remains profoundly wide, as we find it today. And economic growth without inclusive growth is hardly of any benefit to the vast majority of our population. In the fourth volume, Nikhil Day and others, entitled We the People, lay out the argument for why a rights-based paradigm is of crucial importance in India today. And then, of course, you come to the fifth volume, the Shudras Vision for a New Path. The sixth volume has already been published. It's a remarkable work, Her Right to Equality, on women's issues. And very shortly, I think within 6 weeks' time, the next volume will be published on Adivasis. The Adivasis volume was brought very near to completion by Abhay Khaka, many of our friends, shortly before his untimely death. And Ganesh Devi picked up where Abhay Khaka left off and has brought the volume to completion. I think this would be the only book very similar to this work on the Shudras that deals with the Adivasi issues from an entirely internal perspective. After the Adivasis book, there will be a book on the Dalits, where Professor Thorat himself has a chapter as well. And following that, a book on higher education, where Professor Thorat also has a chapter. On healthcare, which is a very pressing issue for all of us right now. Our healthcare crisis has been in the works for some years, and now we see it as fully imploding. Also imploding, as we all know, are our public institutions. There's going to be a volume on the institutional crisis. After that, a volume on youth, and a volume on India's foreign policy, or India and the world. So basically, and I'm leaving out a few, we've got 15 volumes coming in all. Basically, what we're trying to do with these volumes is really rethink India, rethink the India of our imagination, the India that we were in some ways promised, and that has fallen far short of that promise. Now, in doing so, we've brought top, really most experienced activists, intellectuals, as well as policymakers together to chart out a path for what could be a new, a much more just, and certainly a much more choice-worthy and equitable path. So getting to the current volume, the Shudras Vision for a New Path, what is this path that we keep talking about in the series as a whole? And what is the path that Professor Kancha Ilaiah, Shepherd, and Karthik Raja have in mind in when they say vision for a new path with respect to the Shudras? So when we talk about the future path, obviously we're talking about the future. So what the future could hold, or what it ought to hold. And that is not very difficult to articulate. Professor Kancha already spoke about it, an equitable and a prosperous future where Shudras gain, or perhaps even regain, their rightful patrimony. So what does that mean? As Professor Kancha said, this nation, and indeed we could add this civilization, was built almost entirely upon the labor and the labor and action of the Shudras. And for that reason, they must position themselves in order to enjoy the fruits of that labor. Now that sounds like a material struggle, but what's interesting is that the way the editors framed this book, it is not merely a material struggle. It is in fact most fundamentally characterized as a spiritual struggle. And this is the part that I want to talk about. I think other speakers will probably speak more about present situation, present politics, and so on. I'm going to talk about this, what seems to be a side issue, but what is intriguing about the work, it turns out to be the heart of the matter in some respects. Now, when we talk about a spiritual struggle or spiritual justice, it's very difficult to understand what that could possibly mean. We all know about struggles for political justice, struggles for rights, struggles with respect to our remedies, legal position, and so on. We all know about economic justice, for example, the struggle for a right to livelihood, shelter, basically in order to establish the material conditions that would allow us to enjoy our rights. And then we also know about issues like social struggles and social justice. These have, of course, a different, well, I want to use the word ontology. Let's say they have a different being from an economic struggle, because what is distributed when we find an equitable or a just system, what is distributed is not something material, but something intangible, such as dignity or recognition. So an equitable distribution of dignity and recognition forms part of any kind of social struggle. But what on earth is a spiritual struggle in this context? When we talk about the social as immaterial and non-distributable, we start to get some way towards what this spiritual struggle might be. The spiritual struggle goes on in the ideological realm. Now, the ideological realm is not something that is contained, sitting next to the political or the economic or the social. In fact, the ideological permeates each of these. Within politics, we appeal to the ideological. Within economics, we appeal to the ideological. Within the social, we appeal to the ideological. So it is in some way something that gives, it functions as a source of meaning for all of these other domains that we build upon. Now, the ideology that we are mired in, even in the year 2021, despite that more than 70 years ago, we had a political revolution and we had a legal revolution, we remain mired in the ideology of Brahmanism. And we can think about Brahmanism as having, in simple terms, as having two primary components, one of them being patriarchy and the other the principle of graded inequality. It is fundamentally, for these two reasons, an inegalitarian ideology. Now, what's significant about this is that we have a fundamentally egalitarian legal and political system. So if the Constitution established equality in law, and if the Democratic Republic of India established a kind of electoral politics that recognized the equality, at least in terms of voting power, of each and every Indian citizen, what remains today is that we have no ideological, large-scale ideological source to stabilize these legal and political institutions and realities. So we have a constitution and a political structure that not only demands equality, but in fact relies upon it in order for it to function. And yet when we look at the cultural or the historical, the non-political, economic and social resources that we have available to us in order to strengthen our moral positions towards actually realizing equality in practice, what sources of inspiration do we have? Well, largely the religious literature that we are raised upon, even the stories that we are told as children, the myths and legends, the epics that we read, recite, that we hear recited, and that we see reenacted in theater and film. Each of these is entirely infused with Brahmanism. Now, if you have then the need for a large scale or massive struggle that is political, that is economic, that is social, if you are empty of any kind of ideological support or spring to inspire, to guide, and to motivate, and to constitute the telos and the aim of these political, economic, social movements, you're going to fall flat. And the interesting thing, and I'm coming to a close here, that the editors of the book more or less design all the way through each of the fascinating essays in this work, is that the political struggle has been underway and has met great achievements. The economic struggle continues underway. The social struggle continues underway. But it is the ideological realm that has fallen entirely short. And what is responsible for that is basically two things. One, the spiritual slavery, as the editors put it, of the Shudras, of a lack of autonomy in the religious and spiritual spheres. And on the other hand, a total domination or hegemonizing of India's long and diverse cultural, religious, and spiritual practices that have more or less been homogenized into one uniform saffron Brahminical philosophy and religion. And so if we have crushed and obliterated all rival ideologies as appears from the way that philosophy and religion are explained today in both in academia and in popular culture, then there are no alternative or rival spiritual resources to counter the inegalitarian Brahmanism that is the only ideology that permeates in a pan-Indian fashion. So the Shudras, the vision for a new path, turns out to be not only dealing, as several works have in the past, with our political struggles or our social struggles or economic struggles, but it is the first book that really identifies that the struggle today cannot proceed both with the internal difficulties that are faced, for example, uniting Shudras that fail to have any Shudra consciousness, and the external difficulties, for example, the ground and material conditions that force Shudras and Dalits to be antagonistic, especially in rural backgrounds. The first book that recognizes that we need some sort of ideological revolution if we are going to take forward each of these independent but interrelated struggles to a moment where we will finally recognize or realize the promise of that has been captured in the Constitution, and that was articulated by the likes of Phule and Ambedkar. So I really am fascinated by this book. I'm enamored by this book. I think it's one of the most important books of that I can recall reading in recent years, because it has finally cracked the sort of code about why it is that our social, political, economic, and other sorts of movements will continue just to spin wheels without making great progress, unless and until this spiritual slavery that the masses find themselves immersed in gets transcended, and some ideological, some spiritual solution gets found to unite the Shudras and finally permit all of us together to enter into a new vision for India. So my hats off to the editors and all of the contributors for a really, really remarkable book. Thank you for your attention.
Yeah, the next speaker, please.
Yes. Yes. Thank you, Professor Rathore, and thank you, Professor Thorat. So I now invite Dr. Ajay Gudavarti for his remarks.
Okay, so thank you, Simi, and thanks to Arjun. And let me also begin by profusely congratulating Professor Kancha Ilaiah for this wonderful book. I think a very timely intervention in the current situation that we are all in, apart from the pandemic, the political pandemic that we are all collectively facing. I think Professor Kancha Ilaiah has been a very serious voice, challenging the very epistemic, philosophical, and conceptual basis of Hindutva politics, challenging this vision of Hindu Rashtra. And therefore, I see this book as a counter intervention, calling for a counter public against the dominant hegemonic politics. Therefore, on that first count, I'm totally in letter and spirit with Professor Ilaiah and Karthik for editing this book. I also congratulate Professor Ilaiah for this book. I think has, when I read through it, also I think especially the introduction and his own chapter in the volume, I think does a very honest job of identifying various sociological conflicts that we are actually facing today in terms of translating what he refers to as the alternative Shudra vision into a kind of a concrete social and political vision. I don't think it is a readily available kind of a vision today, but it is something that Professor Ilaiah and other young scholars who have contributed to the volume are actually foregrounding something that perhaps was lost in history. Perhaps Buddhism as the first revolution kind of attempted it, and then it was the vision of Ambedkar. And now I think this debate that Professor Ilaiah has been introducing into public sphere for quite some time now, along with other scholars like Professor Thorat is here and others. I think these have been very important interventions in generating kind of counter publics. My co-panelist Akash has already kind of highlighted its significance in terms of introducing, apart from social, economic, and political, a dimension of spiritual justice, spiritual philosophy. What I would do is to therefore, in terms of adding further to what Professor Ilaiah, because I'm completely in spirit with this attempt that he's doing, is that we need to perhaps push the alternative philosophy and the logic that this book offers us. Also the contribution by Arvind, I think your contribution in terms of locating the nature of discrimination, nature of spiritual, what Professor Ilaiah refers to as spiritual fascism, I think is very important even for caste Hindus to kind of understand what has happened in course of history, which has got kind of hidden or kind of lost. It's like a hidden transcript which has been really dug out. But in order to push this, I think we perhaps would need a framework which is already kind of offered in the book, but perhaps we need to push this logic further. And that is where I would like to raise a certain number of questions for Professor Ilaiah and then Arvind and others to think through in terms of how are we going to achieve this, because this process, I think, is going to be quite a complex, quite a self-contradictory process. So a few pointers that I felt that one perhaps needs to think through is that, to begin with, the way it comes through in the book is that I think the fundamental distinction on which Brahmanism and Bahujanism stand is the mental manual division. That the way productive labor has been kind of stigmatized and delegitimized by Brahmanical conception. Today, how would that translate? I mean, it's one thing to claim. I think Professor Ilaiah was one of the early public intellectuals in India who kind of brought in this idea that, of course, after Phule and others, that Shudras stand for a productive philosophy, that they're attached to a certain kind of a productive work, unlike the leisure-oriented, simply ideational work of Brahmanism. So today, if we were to claim this, how would this translate in concrete social and economic terms? That on one hand, we are talking about Shudra mobility into higher professions of teaching, into IT industry, into those forms which we would ideally locate it in terms of ideational work. On the other hand, we also seem to be wanting to glorify, wanting to signify productive labor, especially related to agriculture. I think that part of that crisis is perhaps visible in the agrarian crisis that India is going through. I think Arvind's piece might want to kind of reflect and extend this logic that there might be a certain kind of a self-canceling contradiction here. That how would we, it is easy to kind of do away with, critically do away with menial jobs like scavenging, other things. One can have a critique. But what does one do with productive labor? For instance, when much of upwardly mobile Shudra caste today do not want to remain in the agriculture sector. They want to move on into beyond agriculture sector. I think one of the reasons why the farmers movement took the turn of an OBC politics was perhaps to move away from agriculture into more modern formal economy and formal sectors. Then obviously this kind of a Shudra philosophy that Professor Ilaiah is grounding it in agrarian productive labor does not automatically get reflected. So what would, for instance, a concrete question like how would we address this question of productive intermediary Shudra caste wanting to move away from the agrarian sector? How would we, in this kind of new vision for a new path, how would we address it? Where would we locate a question like this? Similarly, the second question that I would invite my colleagues to reflect upon is the place of myth and mythologies. Much of this book kind of translates the presence of myths, which is very important. I think modernity does not do away with myths. Lot of our popular consciousness, lot of our social imagination, I think is squarely continues to be guided by myths and mythologies. But what should then the Shudra philosophy's equation be with myth and mythologies? Because on one hand, we are emphasizing the need for modernization of Shudras, of them getting into modern economy, English education. Therefore, on one hand, we seem to be taking modernity as the alternative. That the modernity is a kind of a solution, because I think even I think Dr. Ambedkar had this high modernist thinking in terms of modern state, laws, so on and so forth. I think there might be some amount of tension there in terms of how do we look at myths and mythologies within the Shudra philosophy? What would be the perspective? That are we trying to re-signify the popular symbols present in myth and mythologies? Are we trying to argue that much of this is superstition and something that we have to do away with? So there is a scriptural sanction that Brahmanism uses by creating myths and mythologies. Reading through the book, I found that tension, I think, is present all through the book in terms of, on one hand, trying to read myths and mythologies as history, which I feel there is a certain amount of validity for that, because those myths do not simply remain in our head as ideational categories or symbols, but they actually translate into social relations. So what would, in this new path of Shudra philosophy, what should our equation be with mythology or myths? Do we debunk it? Do we re-signify it? Are we looking at, therefore, I think if we have to also escape this crisis that modernity creates with things like sacredness, spirituality, and myths and mythologies. My third point would be, I think, again, I think Professor Ilaiah's article, introduction, and other essays, I think, have been very bold in pointing out to this entire contradiction between Shudras and Dalits. I think while at many places this comes through in the book, that and Professor Ilaiah, I think, does make a call that we need to overcome this, but it has been traced mostly to what he calls as ignorance of history. But if we are to push this logic a little further, that it is not merely ignorance of history that pushes this conflict between Shudras and Dalits on one end and Shudras and Muslims on the other side, I think we will need a more hardened sociological theory, more hard social theory in terms of locating internal power dynamics within a dominant Shudra caste, especially, that push them towards this kind of, while I agree with Professor Ilaiah's formulation that Hindutva kind of attempts to reduce Shudras to muscle men and kind of foot soldiers for its larger project. But I think there might be a case here to also look at the internal, given their precarious location in the caste order above Dalits, below the Dvijas, and given the social power that, the gap in the social power. I'm only wondering if one way to understand this in terms of internal power dynamics within Shudras, in terms of ownership, land patterns, many other factors. I don't have the time to get into all of that. Then how would we address this concrete question of this alternative kind of a counter public that this book kind of proposes, where all Shudras come together, across in terms of realizing and owning up this identity. I think that's a wonderful part of the book, that we need to have this kind of a counter public. I am in complete agreement with the book that kind of a counter public is the only hope that we really have in checking this kind of a mammoth, aggressive, monolithic order that we are witnessing. But I'm only wondering that the book really does not suggest any concrete imagination in terms of what to do with these concrete material social conflicts. I think Bahujan, idea of the Bahujan also did something very similar, that it went in for a kind of a political alliance between Dalits, OBCs and Muslims, but it offered us no concrete social strategies to fight the existing prejudices between OBCs, Dalits and Muslims. And therefore, the part of the crisis that we are witnessing today in terms of certain kind of a retreat of Dalit Bahujan philosophy, I think is partly because we are not able to think through what do we do in terms of internal power dynamics within this Shudra caste. There are set of prejudices within Shudra caste. Today, I think most of you would agree that OBCs have become the backbone of the BJP and RSS all across India. If there's any unifying factor for the RSS as an all India social formation, it is the massive shift of the OBCs. And this, I think, cannot be simply understood as ignorance of history. We'll have to produce a more profound social theory to kind of see that there are internal, perhaps, power dynamics. I agree with Professor Ilaiah that part of it is being pushed to the wall, denial of opportunities, which the RSS is kind of playing upon by providing representation, by providing things of that kind. My last question and then certain agreement would be that I think Professor Ilaiah in his own other writings extensively has kind of framed innumerable kind of symbolic struggles, and which I think are part of his idea of spiritual struggle. But today, if we look at right-wing populism very closely, what it precisely does is to appropriate these symbols. I think there is a certain kind of a flexibility that right-wing politics in the modern context have. These are not politics of the early 20th century. I think we are into a context where we are into a cultural logic of late capitalism, where right-wing politics can have appropriate. So, for instance, I'm in complete agreement with Professor Ilaiah in terms of how power configuration happened in post-independence period, how a certain caste Hindu tiny minority dominated. But can we understand these machinations purely through this caste, through this such a caste calculus? For instance, the BJP's appropriation of Sardar Patel today by building that huge statue is a symbolic appropriation. I mean, it's very difficult then for us to say that this appropriation is not an authentic appropriation. Tomorrow, I can even go one step further and predict that tomorrow the next step for BJP is Mathura after Ram Janmabhoomi. Today, we might say that Ram has been appropriated by RSS because he's a Kshatriya. But tomorrow with Mathura, they are going to appropriate Lord Krishna, who being a Yadav can be called a Shudra. What do we then do? I mean, what kind of a critique does this kind of a framework really offers us tomorrow if RSS is to appropriate Lord Krishna as the next major figure in the Hindu pantheon, and he being a Shudra does not really offer us any critical vantage point to kind of say that RSS cannot do this or will not be able to do this, because I think the very nature of Hinduism is very porous. It is a continuous game of inclusion and exclusion. So my serious suggestion and my serious plea with this young team would be that I think we need to really think in terms of more invested social theory. I mean, symbolic critique is welcome. I think it's very necessary given the nature of Hinduism and nature of Brahmanism in India. But I think these concrete social conflicts that some of which I've pointed out is something that I think I would expect that this nature of generating this counter publics of Shudras. I think this has to be a long-term project. This cannot be a one-off book, but this has to be a long-term dialogue where I think these young scholars should sit through, and I think with a sense of honesty and authenticity need to discuss these self-canceling contradictions. I would conclude by arguing, I think one of the stellar insights the book really produces, which I would say that we should further really build on, is this entire kind of a trivalent equivalence and equation that developed between Brahmanism, left, and secularism. I think that's the single most somewhere it's lost in the book. It's kind of signaled in Professor Ilaiah's essays and in a couple of places. But I think this is a very important insight the book really offers us, that this kind of an equivalence, that the upper caste use of the language of secularism does not really, in a way, it worked in terms of disempowering Shudras and other subaltern castes. And therefore, this new equation that came between Brahmin left and secularism, which even Piketty points out, he calls it left Brahmin in his book on ideology, and Cap in his recent book. And I think those are, particularly very, very important insights that the book produces. But as I said, on one hand, I would expect that this philosophy over a period should engage with some of these very deep empirical ontological conflicts. On the other end, I would argue that Bahujanism, or the new Shudra philosophy, I think has to appeal for a new normative universal, that it ought to be an alternative, because Brahmanism is essentially a philosophy of sectarianism. What Bahujanism or Shudra philosophy stand for is a new kind of a normative universal that brings in alternative principles where it can concretely kind of translate into concrete social demands. And the book, I think, stops short of raising this. For instance, we should push for full employment, free and quality education for all. I think there have to be concrete social demands that we need to really push, so that these goes beyond a caste kind of location. Well, caste can be a starting point, vantage point for counter public, but we may not need to necessarily stop with this and produce social demands that are more inclusive, and that's best way to produce a kind of counter hegemony. I'll stop here and thank Professor Ilaiah and Professor Thorat once again for this opportunity.
Thank you, Ajay.
Thank you, sir, for raising very important points and also drawing your observations on the dynamics of power. How do we bring about imagination of countering prejudices, and also the need for an invested social theory. So with these important discussions and points that have been made, I think that the stage is set for Professor Thorat to come in and share his thoughts. Professor Thorat, over to you.
Thank you.
No, Arvind has not spoken.
Arvind sir will speak after answering all the questions.
Okay.
No, you can speak. There is no problem, please.
Arvind sir, do you want to speak now?
Yeah, why not? Arvind, please go ahead.
Please,
Arvind sir, your mic is on mute.
Very good evening. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Very good evening. Thanks, IMPRI, for providing me this opportunity. But because it is a platform of policy, let me begin by thanking Professor Thorat, who is also chairman of this session, that as UGC chairman, he had ensured one policy to fulfill the backlog seats reserved for the SCs and STs in the universities across the country. At least in national capital of Delhi, I can ensure that I was witness to that. And today that the Delhi University is very on a fast mode doing the caste promotion career advance scheme through career advance scheme. I'm sure in another few years, we will not have less than 2,000 professors belonging to two marginalized communities of this country, the SCs and the STs. I would call them the Dalits and the Adivasis. So let me thank Professor Thorat for your journey in this, in the foray of social justice. Let me thank Professor Ilaiah for considering me worth writing the lead essay for this volume, which is under discussion, The Nation and its Shudras. Well, I'm sure this distinguished panel this evening would agree with me that the third marginalized section, except for the Adivasis and the Shudras, the biggest social category in India has been the Shudras, more popularly known as OBCs in contemporary time. And this category does not have even a single professor in a single central university of this country across length and breadth of this country till this book was going for press as in 2020 December, because this book has been released February 2021. Well, how appropriate is to use this category of Sudra instead of OBC, Professor Ilaiah has already explained about. So I will not go into theoretical construction and the methodological questions. But there are one question I definitely would, as a contributor to this volume, would want to foreground, is that one wonders if ancient category of Brahmins, the Kshatriyas, the Vaisyas continues even today, even when they have always been numerically in minority. But categories of Sudras who formed the majority even during ancient times, even during medieval times and modern times, have disappeared from the public sphere. And can anybody deny the fact that the category of Ati Sudra, whom we, who later became untouchables and Dalits, there is a book by Eleanor Gilliard, From Untouchables to Dalits. So there is this whole journey of that category also. But can anybody deny that the, the concept of even Ati Sudra in Phule's parlance, emerged out of the Sudra category. It proliferated from the Sudra category only. So broadly, out of the four categories, the Sudras and Ati Sudras, to me, has been one category. It is just that, historical injustices that has been done to them. And I recall Professor Rodriguez, in his essential writings of Ambedkar in early 2000, he had written, and, I still remember his sentence. He said, Ambedkar was a man who had a firm belief in written word. You know what has happened with the Sudras in this country? Nothing has been written. And who would write? Those who were, given the opportunity to read and write. So Sudras, as per the, Manusmriti, did not have the right to read and write. So who would write? Phule, of course, because of the Britishers and the missionaries, had access to English education, and he wrote slavery. He wrote Gulamgari in Marathi, but at least he had this mastery or the agency of English language to at least write, the introduction of Gulamgiri in English. And therefore, Professor Ilaiah keeps on repeating that we need English as a liberating sort of, agency. So from that perspective, what I see, and, the latest one, I have I can go on and on, but even, the Dalit category, as someone who has, because I myself am a born Sudra, but my research is on the Black Panthers and the Dalit Panthers. While I was researching on the Dalit Panthers, and one of the most sought after, very standard social science Indian journal is Economic and Political Weekly. And when I looked for the essays or the things on Dalit question in Economic and Political Weekly on the Dalit Panthers, in 1973 a small piece appears, and the title reads, "The Children of the God Become Panther," which means even till then the title is not Dalit Panthers. Even the area where I come from, the bordering district of Bihar and Jharkhand, even today, Prevention of Atrocities Act is called as Harijan Act. So therefore, and these issues have been well dealt into academic circle. Like Gopal Guru also writes in seminar, The Politics of Naming, and how any category has its own sort of, limitation and contradictions, so on and so forth. But my last question in terms of methodology, and this would also address to what Professor Gudavardi said about the exclusion, how did Sudras remain excluded? How does it so happen, sir, that even in JNU, no professor writes anything that Mark Galanter from America writes about? India saw a kind of electoral this one of the backward classes, which was tapped by Christopher Jefferley, and he writes India's Silent Revolution. And around that time, or even before that, what M.N. Srinivas writes is cast India's 20th century avatar. So all I'm saying that whether we call it backward classes, because even there is a debate between backward classes and depressed classes also. Ambedkar himself in the 9th volume. I forgot the page number, but it is 308 or 328. It is part of what Congress and Gandhi have done to the untouchables in that volume, where he says, like, the people belonging to the depressed classes themselves were opposing for the users of the depressed classes. So as far as this Sudra category, particularly I coming from North India, or rather Eastern India, I would argue that both the categories, the reserved categories within the Sudras, as well as the non-reserved categories, that is, if we club in both OBCs and Sudras, and broadly, the conceptually that we have arrived at with this volume is the Sudra word, the Sudra will have to realize, including the Jats, including the Yadavs, including the Koiris, including the Kurmis, even if they were supposedly dominant caste in their arena, they were only dominant in terms of farming. Had they been really dominant, they would have got access to universities, to judiciary, so and so forth, which Professor Ilaiah has already explained. So my final point with this, I will end, because they are distinguished panelists to argue, and I will come later to answer some of the questions which Professor Gudavarti raised. My whole point is how is Sudra lost? And this, in that sense, and again, I would go back to Professor Guru's one of the old article where he had argued that how egalitarian are Indian social sciences in India. And in that he says there is a pernicious divide between theoretical Brahmins and empirical Sudras. So I, as someone Sudra who for years has been reading, writing, I always thought that all I'm doing is empirical work. But I am satisfied today that with this essay that I have written for this volume, I attempted to, as a Sudra, attempted to theorize something that if we imagine a nation, where are those 52% of whom we call Sudras? How are they lost? How have they been erased from the history, particularly from the written, and we all know, the modern democracies run on pen and pencil. It doesn't run like, vocally how good we speak, but it runs on how good we write and what do we write, because that is only treasured. Now with modern technologies, whatever we speak, that is also treasured. But for long years, thousands of years of history is only treasured, which is written. And the Sudra volume, as the first volume of a collection of Sudras, is a kind of foray towards that theoretical constructions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, sir. Thorat, over to you.
Hello.
Yes.
Shall I speak now?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. It has been a very enriching discussion, first by Kancha Ilaiah, and then Rathod and the Ajay and the Arvind. Yes, indeed, it's the first volume where the young scholar have written about the problem of issues of Shudra and their vision. Unfortunately, because of the internet problem here in Delhi where I stay, I could not download the book, and so I could not read the introduction, which possibly summarized the central argument of the book. However, I gotten some idea from what Kancha Ilaiah said and what Rathod had said. Therefore, I would like to make a couple of points, not on the basis of rigorous analysis of the book, but on the basis of the point made by Kancha Ilaiah and others, and my own understanding about the issue of other backward caste and the Shudras. Well, I think the speaker, Kancha Ilaiah and Rathod and others have focused on the three aspects of Shudra. So whatever the way we define Shudra, that is to combine OBC and the upper Shudras, as we can say. First is the, of course, their economic characterization, then the political characterization, and finally the ideological position with respect to Shudra. I have been working recently based on the National Sample Survey data, and also written at all India level as well as at the level of the Maharashtra. The problem of the other backward class, which also include the upper Shudra in a way, comes out quite clearly, and that gives me some insight as to what are the special problem of the OBC and other backward class and Shudras. In that context, I believe that the one of the problems with dealing with OBC and upper Shudras, because they are upper Shudras also trying to include them in Shudras now. Jat, Marathas, and others. But prominent example are Jat and Marathas and Patel are trying to include and seeking reservation and seeking the status of Shudra. Now, my thinking on this issue is to raise question to the young scholar. The first question is with respect to economy. I think what the young scholar need to understand is to undertake studies on the empirical studies on the problem of Shudras. In the absence of those empirical studies, the generalization based on the limited data and understanding will not lead them to a proper even solution, let alone the understanding the situation of the Shudras. So my first point I would like to make is that there are not enough studies on the socio-economic condition of the Shudras, and what we get is only we get from the category of other backward class, but that is a substantial category. Most of the Shudras are a part of OBCs. And the National Sample Survey data brings out all aspects of the Shudras, all aspects of the OBCs. After 2000, we get an disaggregated data by high caste, by OBC, by scheduled caste, by even OBC among the Muslims. Now, I think I will request to the young scholar that before jumping to the conclusion, you should examine, with the help of the data, the economic situation of the Shudras. And then I think based on the analysis, based on the data, will also lead to understand the situation and come to an appropriate policies. Otherwise, we will remain in generality. Now, for example, let me take the first issue of economics. Now, to say that the Shudras are the productive classes is exactly correct, because they were the cultivators, Shudras were the cultivators. And as a result of that, they were the worker, physical worker, they produce. And the other important point, which Kancha is also making for quite some time, which I like that point, is that, which Dr. Ambedkar has made, that the education, there has not been a general education, public education in India, as per the Hinduism. So there was restriction on education to Shudras, to untouchables, and to Vaishya, even to Kshatriyas. They had access to education, but they were not allowed to use it for the occupation. But the Shudras suffered from the lack of education. No, and there were no general education. So they could not, there were no colleges, agriculture colleges or institution at that period of time. So there was no way of learning the agriculture technology, developing agriculture technology. So the Shudras, by engaging into cultivation, they developed technology. Whatever technologies were available to us before the high yielding variety and new technology came in, about the quality of the seed, about how much manure you should use, how much irrigation you should use, what yield you will get. These all technology were developed by the Shudras, and they were developed not through formal education, but through the passing of the knowledge from the father to the son. So through their experiences, they develop this technology, and the productivity increases. So to that extent, it is certainly that the Shudras are they're engaged in productive activity. They produce food, they food non-food, and they feed the entire population, which was a non-cultivating population. So that is very, very important. I think the young scholars should also read. I think Praveen, perhaps the last speaker, mentioned that the Atishudras, which became the untouchable finally, were part of the Shudras. Yes, that is true. If you take Manusmriti and all the disability of Richard type that are indicated there are for Shudras. And Manu is very clear. Manu mentioned that there is no fifth class caste. It's only fourth. But all those disability which are indicated in the Manusmriti are not to a large extent applicable to Shudras, except the restriction on occupation, restriction on education. All those disabilities are passed on to the untouchables. And there were Chandalas at that point of time, and they were excluded and isolated. But at least the Shudras were freed from all those disability and punishment, and they were transferred on the untouchable. And a part of the Shudra, which we now call Atishudra, for whatever reason they were considered polluting or not, the Atishudra became a part of the untouchable. But the Shudra which remain as a cultivating caste, to them this disability were not applied to that extent, except the restriction on education and other things. Now there are Japanese scholars, and there are you must read the economic history. You may not agree with R.S. Sharma, but the Shudras in ancient India, you must read. You must read Vivekananda Jha, who has written on his PhD thesis on untouchable. There they show, there they tell you how the transaction from the Shudra to Atishudra happened, and a part of the Shudra became untouchables. And all disabilities that you find mentioned in the Manusmriti are applicable to them, but not to the Shudra, upper Shudra, which remain part of the fourth one. Japanese scholars have particularly discovered, and even I think R.S. Sharma also has pointed out that in the 7th century AD, it is that period when the Shudra began to have cultivations. Now, I was surprised that if you look at the Manusmriti, Manusmriti has a clear-cut classification of occupation, and Shudra have none. They are supposed to be the wage laborer. If Shudra of Manusmriti were wage laborer, how come they become cultivated? That's an issue that you must understand. And how they get separated from the so-called untouchable. The explanation is to be found in Manusmriti. If you look at Manusmriti, in the event of distress, Manusmriti has made relaxation. In the event of distress, Brahmin can take the occupation of any caste, of Kshatriya, Vaishya, and even to certain extent agriculture, although it criticized that agriculture is something which is not proper occupation because it kills the animals when you plow. But nevertheless, there is a complete freedom for Brahmin in the event of distress. They could take any occupation. To the Shudra, the Manu Shudra, it is mentioned that if they can't survive by wage labor, because the wage labor was the only occupation of Shudra of Manu, they could also go for cultivation and artisan. And since the agriculture has been considered as an inferior occupation, so it was pushed to the Shudras. And we do not know, one has to study and really examine this aspect, that how come Shudra began to become a cultivator. While in Manusmriti, Shudras do not have right to land. Their only job is the wage labor. Now the Japanese scholars have done some research on, and they have come to the conclusion that that provision of Manusmriti, and gradually the Shudra began to have an tenant cultivator, then the owner cultivator, and the ownership of land also come to them. So that is some of this history you will have to see before you really generalize. Now, the Shudra that we have today, if we see what is the I was talking of economic, that Shudras are the productive. And I say, yes, they are the one who are engaged in the production. But you must also mention and do not fall short of that the bulk of the labor that was on the Shudras agriculture was Dalit labor, was the untouchable labor. That is very clear today, and even at that point of time. So the productive activities is the combined effect of the Shudra and the Ati Shudra or untouchable. And later on, the situation of the untouchable has become so bad that the untouchables were converted to a slavery. The Manusmriti recognized slavery, Narada recognized slavery. Hindu literature, you have a slavery, but you have a graded slavery. And during the British period, there was a law commission which looked into the slavery, and a report was prepared. And based on that, in 1843, the slavery in India was banned. But there is a whole lot of literature in that law commission report is that the untouchable were a slave caste. They were not only untouchable caste, but they were a slave caste. Now, the slave labor, you have to look at the book by Sanal Mohan, published by Oxford in 2010. Please read that book. Slavery, untouchable slave. Now, untouchable slave were the slave of even the Shudras in Kerala, in Tamil Nadu. Now, so you must, while theorizing about the economic situation of the Shudra, you have to read properly, you have to then generate the data and make the generalization. That yes, Shudras were the productive laborer, they produce through their land, but also they produce on the exploitative labor of the untouchable. Kshatriya does that, Brahmin does that. In Tamil Nadu, the Mirasi Jamindar, Mirasis were Brahmin, they had a complete control over the untouchable labor as a slave labor. So please, I think you will have to, when you generalize, you will have to do research in the past and the present. Today, there is no doubt that if you look at the percentage of wage laborer and data, let us take 2017 and 18, and if you take the share of the OBC population, scheduled caste and higher caste population, the share of the landowner among the OBCs is almost in proportion to their population. While the share of the scheduled caste in the land, in rural India, I'm talking about, is much, much less than their share in the population, which is 70%. But you have also to realize that the proportion of wage labor among the Shudras, OBC is also higher than the high caste. It is lower than the scheduled caste, but higher than the high caste. It is this graded inequality that you have to understand. Unless you don't read Ambedkar, we don't have inequality, haves and have not, poor and non-poor. We have a graded inequality. That the Brahmins are better than Kshatriya, Kshatriyas are better than Vaishya, Vaishyas are better than Shudra, and Shudras are worse than the Vaishya, but they are better than untouchable. And untouchable at the bottom of the caste hierarchy are the worst. So I think you have to understand this characterization of caste system by Dr. Ambedkar in volume 3. Please read it. Essential feature of caste system and unique feature of caste system, where he defined that the caste system is based on graded inequality, which the French sociologists and other, then they use the word hierarchy and build up the entire theory. But Dr. Ambedkar talk about that graded inequality much earlier. Now, this graded inequality creates the problem. The problem that Rathod and Kancha Ilaiah has referred to, that ideologically the Shudra are not able to define themselves and fall back upon Brahmanism, that is because of the graded hierarchy. Because the Shudras feel satisfied that there are 3 castes above them who exploit them, but there is a 1 caste below them which exploit. And that's the reason why there is a lack of struggle against the wholehearted struggle against the caste system and Brahmanism among the Shudra. That's one of the reasons. Now, so please, I am not going to go into greater detail that about the economic situation. Now, the points are made that they are less in industry, less in businesses. Now, the Vaishya could say that we are less in agriculture. So I think this argument will have to be very cautiously, because historically you have occupation, and though you tend to remain in those occupations, and caste provided less opportunities. So what is critical is that when you have to ask question about the Shudra is, did they have an access to means of production, income earning asset, may not business, may not industry, but they had land. Untouchable did not have land, untouchable did not have business, untouchable did not have education. But then the disadvantage of OBC was they did not have access to education. They did not have as much access to occupation, businesses. So they remain. But they have one important instrument in their hand, that was land. And it is land which has given them mobility. The land being the source of income earning asset, they could take education, they could start agro industry. You have to go to Maharashtra and see that how agriculture industry, sugar industry, another industry came up because of his linkages with agriculture. Agriculture gave them income and they enter into the rural industry. So that was simply because that the Shudra had a ownership right to the land, which the Dalit did not have. So land has provided them mobility. Now, educational right has been denied, so they are lagging behind, but they are coming up. You have to see the educational institution. You must go and see the National Sample Survey, Higher Education Survey. You will see that the educational institutions started and owned by OBCs and Shudras are large in number. As a result of that, the Shudras children have got access. In Maharashtra, it is an amazing story. Jyotiba Phule started the school, but Maharshi Shinde started Rayas Shikshan Society. Rayas Shikshan Society is one of the largest society in Maharashtra. Shivaji Education Society, started by another Shudra, Punjab Rao Deshmukh, is one of the largest. Marathwada Education Society is one of the largest in Marathwada. I do not know about, same story is Karnataka, another state. You have to see that. So this ownership of land has given them the advantage, given the Shudra the advantage, and that has given them the mobility. So we cannot turn around the argument that they are not into industry, because not all will go into industry. The Vaishya and the other will say that we are not into agriculture. So this caste has divided us, but what the indicator that you have to take, that to what extent the OBCs are poor, to what extent they lack resources, to what extent they are lagging behind in education. Those are the indicator that you should take and compare it with the higher Shudra or Shudra and Vaishya and also the. Then you will get the proper meaning. There are other points that I would like to mention about economics, which I'll stop. Now let me come to the political point. Now it has been made that they are not into politics, that they have not occupied higher position. I think the story of politics is known to everybody. The OBCs and the Shudra combined, they are in majority everywhere, in every state, and they have occupied the power for the last 60 years. So to say that they are not in power is not a correct characterization and theorization. Please, if I take my state Maharashtra and if I combine Kunbi and Maratha together, they are holding power for the last 60 years, and that is the story every state. It is an example, correct example, that there has not been a prime minister, if you avoid Charan Singh and all that, but there has been Home Minister Shankarrao Chauhan, Yashwantrao Chauhan, and there are many of them who were in this thing. So I think one has to understand that in politics, because of the predominant larger share of the population, the political power in the state has been in the hand of the OBC, has been in the hand of OBC combined Shudras. In villages, there is no question of power going to any other person, because there are no Brahmins, there are no very high caste. Shudras untouchable get simply because of reservation. So please look into this political aspect also, that when you talk about political powerlessness, you have to look at it from the perspective, from the larger perspective. Whether you hold power at village level, in Jilla Parishad, you hold at the state level, and whether what was the participation at the center. Yes, there was no prime minister, so the highest position is there are issues. There were no perhaps president. So while there were two president from the Dalit, so there are issues. I'm not saying that, but if you look at the holding of power, which benefit in many ways, You have to look at it properly, study it, and identify properly. The reason I am telling you that you have to identify where lacks, the biggest question is where the OBC lacks behind. If you emphasize where they do not lack, then you are in trouble. Anybody can object. Anybody can give data. But you have to identify where they lack. And I have tried to do in my study that they lack in education. That is why they lack in as a vice chancellor in Central University. Beside casteism and other things, they lack in other positions also. But if you take other positions, they are far ahead of it. If you go to the colleges, private aided colleges, say in Maharashtra and elsewhere, which are started by the Shudras, their proportion is much higher. So you have to study properly that where the OBC lacks and where they should, then the policy should be there meant for them. So if you generalize, and even if you identify their advantages as a weakness, you will be in trouble. Let me come to the last point, the ideology. No, ideological point is that Shudra has a glorious history of fighting against the caste. You know, when I was chairman of ICSSR, I give a biggest project to Kancha Ilaiah. I say, Kancha, work on the caste, anti-caste movement and anti-Brahmanical movement of Shudras, because the present Shudras have forgotten the past. And therefore, you have to bring that book out. I do not know whether Kancha has brought that book out or not. It has to be brought. Today, when we say that the Shudras have been taken over by the BJP and other ideologies, you have to identify the causality of it. And you have to look into it. There is a glorious history of, if I start with Maharashtra, that Namdev descent in 14th century, then in Tukaram in the 16th century, then series of writers, entire Warkari movement, the Sant movement, the Kabir movement, the Adi movement. These are all movement of Shudras. Untouchable were nowhere in the picture at that point of time. Or the movement of Periyar, or the movement of Narayan Guru. And you will get, or you go to Orissa, there is a thesis by one of the students, Shudra Muni, who first brought the Brahmanical literature, some of the Brahmanical literature in the Oriya language. So the Shudras have been fighting against Brahmanism as well as casteism. But what has happened is that again the graded inequality, their slightly higher position above the Dalit, have deterred them, have discouraged them to go completely against the Brahmins. You can see the story of Periyar. Periyar's movement was completely against Brahmanism, but his benefit, anti-Brahmanism, remained confined to Shudras. It has not transferred as much as on them. Again, and some of them fall then prey to the Sanskritization. Same is the story of Narayan Guru. Narayan Guru talk about one God and one temple and all that kind of thing. But again, it has its own limitation. It was only some of the Shudras. Phule was very clear-headed person. But Phule has been denied by their own people. Even Malis, of which subcaste he belonged, they do not accept in Maharashtra. So you have to analyze the ideological problem of Shudras. Why is it that despite the fact that their position was fourth, untouchable or fifth, they have not raised as strongly as Dalit have risen against the Brahmanism and the casteism? The reason is to be found in graded caste hierarchy, because they are above the untouchable and they feel happy about it, while they feel unhappy about being below the other three castes. There is other reason also, that the Brahmanism has used a methodology of assimilation and accommodation in a manner such that they kill this anti-caste movement by Shudras. Namdev, Tukaram, all these people have been converted, their temples have been constructed. And you find, if you go to temples, there is a rituals and there is a sacrifice. Their major thoughts have been taken away. Basveshwara was a Brahmin person, but what has happened to his movement? So all anti-caste movement and anti-Brahmanical movement, particularly by the Shudras, has been absorbed by Brahmanism in a manner such that its really revolutionary character is gone. Now you have to study why it is gone. Why it is that the Dalit have not compromised. In electoral politics, Dalit might have compromised. A larger proportion of Dalit now voted for BJP. Larger proportion of Shudra voted for BJP. I'm not worried about that. Those Shudra will come back. Those who have voted to BJP for political reason, because they do not get share in the Congress and other, they will come back. But we have to raise the question about ideology. That a substantial portion of Shudras are falling prey to the Brahminical ideology without realizing the danger of it, that they will suffer. So therefore now the present political party has understood. You are talking that there is not a single central vice chancellor. I have so many vice chancellor of OBC in my state because they understood now. OBC also raised the question that we support it and we don't get it. So they are getting it now. So that is for political gain. So I am not worried about that. That political gain can understanding can be brought backward. But the ideological conversion, which Rathod and others have mentioned, even Kancha Ilaiah has pointed out, his concern about it. That has to be the focus. Why Shudra has a limitation in going whole or against the Brahmanism, which the untouchable do not have. So I think the process of Sanskritization, a limited anti-Brahmanism, remain within the fold of larger diversified Hinduism. These are the issues of Shudra which need to be understood. I have expressed my point on 3 areas. I will conclude by saying my first point, particularly to the young scholar, that first empirically study the status of Shudras. Study political movement, study their participation in political process, study the ideological movement of the Shudras and why they have backtracked. Why is it that the anti-Brahmin movement in Periyar did not cross beyond the Shudra? It benefits Shudra, but it benefits less to Dalit. So if you have to form a united front, then you have to understand this. I will share with you that I am not very fascinated by this Bahujan concept. Bahujan is a numerical concept. That Dalit, Adivasi and OBCs are numerical. What does that mean? There is a contradiction between them. They haven't ever come. I remember that I went to Ramlila where Kanchiram was giving a lecture. There was a Padri, there was a Christian priest, there was a Muslim, there was a Sikh. All of them were together. What happened today? Only the scheduled caste remain. So Bahujan concept doesn't help on the basis of numerical number. You have to talk on the basis of ideology. That there is an ideology which harm Shudra, there is an ideology which harm Dalit, there is an ideology which harm tribals, and it is against that ideology, which has both material and social component, that you have to oppose. On the basis of numerical, it doesn't work. It has the concept of Bahujan in Uttar Pradesh has completely shattered down. So these are some of the points that I wanted to share with you. You may like, you may not like, but because I interact with Kancha Ilaiah, I enjoy his writing. These are questions I raised to him. But since there is a larger group now, I thought I should share with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Sukhadeo Thorat. It was such amazing listening to you and your points that you have made. And certainly it should echo to all of us and for throwing out very, very important questions upon us and also motivating us to, in fact, study empirically before making any generalizations. So thank you very much, sir. So with this, I would now invite Professor Kancha Ilaiah to respond. And I am very happy to inform you that we have very interesting and somewhat provocative questions also. So maybe after sir's, yes, sir. Sir? Yes, sir. Over to you, Professor Kancha Ilaiah.
Okay.
So there is some connection issue. Your voice just broke for a bit. So now you're audible. So could you say some words, please?
Yeah, I will. Yeah, can you hear me?
Please go on,
Yes,
sir.
yes,
Yeah,
yes, please.
Yeah, I'll just respond quickly for the broad point that Professor Thorat was making. Now, precisely the issue that he was in another sense was talking, that the concept of Shudra has never been put for an academic or intellectual scrutiny for a long time, and there was, in fact, never. Whether R.S. Sharma wrote or Ambedkar only wrote an ideological piece around Shudras, but R.S. Sharma or even Sharad Patil, they were not ideological. It was only historical examination. This is the book that is intended to put the question of Shudra identity in the academic and intellectual domain. Because one of the young scholars, Om Prakash, when he sent a paper to Indian Social Science Conference with a title of Shudra, they rejected it. But there were several papers with the title Dalit. So then he wrote a strong letter that this is an historical category. If your ignorance does not want me to be there, I will not come. Now tomorrow, if JNU or Delhi University, some of the students want to study the Shudra history with that title, many professors may not allow. Professor Thorat, you know that this was the situation on Dalit question before 1990. Academicians would not allow that.
Yeah.
Now, the Dalit question has crossed that boundary, whereas the 52% Shudra issue ideologically have not crossed. That is the biggest poverty of Shudras. In my view, land is not richness. Knowledge is richness. And how can one explain that from the day of writing of Rigveda to till today, when Dalits and Shudras were together as Shudra, before Buddhism came, they did not ask for spiritual equality, and there was no violent battle. Now, today, Dalits across India, if you count the castes, only in Telangana, Andhra Pradesh, there were 96. There are internal problems. But the idea of Dalit has given them a national and international identity. Similar situation should happen to Shudras. Unless there is a philosophical thinking of idea of equality, see, we must philosophically understand one historical philosophical question. A human being or a group of human beings want to be unequal with somebody else above, agree to be unequal with above. In this case, all the Shudras agreed to be unequal with the Brahmin and accepted him as the god, and unequal with Kshatriya, unequal with Vaishya. The same human lord will not also grant equality to people below them. This has to be broken philosophically, not number-wise. Empiricism does not solve this problem. You know, Bible created problems, Bible solved problems. Revolutions occurred within biblical thought. Martin Luther emerged. And Islam remained with one prophet thought and got stuck there. There is no production philosophy within them. And my problem, I think it should be this young team's or the Shudra thinkers' problem. How do you explain that 52% of population did not produce one single thinker of Ambedkar status from the Mahar community, which is a small community? What happened to them? How do you explain that? There is a problem of philosophy, not numbers or data verification or statistical verification. It is the question of understanding God. Ambedkar understood who is his God, but Shudra never understood. The idea is to see that when RSS, BJP are ruling with the idea of God, I want to at least place on the Indian record that you must also see God. This Brahmin should not be between you and God. Then you should get out of a Dalit being an agent of somebody else. That is the idea of this book. Therefore, philosophy cannot be replaced with numbers or data. There was no data science before 20th century, yet human beings produced. Philosophy production happened. Therefore, I think we are working on a different trajectory. I was part of the Dalit movement all through my life, and I was the one who wrote Dalitization is the solution and why I'm not here. Until today, I'm telling Shudras that you have to Dalitize. So how does that happen is the question. I'll just take up one question that Ajay raised. You know, numbers and number of cars is not the problem for construction of a philosophical identity. The problem is there for Brahmins. Hundreds of Gotras, hundreds of Jatis, yet Brahmin. That problem is there with Banyas. Today, Jain Banya does not, earlier they do not even see each other. But today, a Jain Amishra and Banya Modi are working together. They have evolved an identity. And all Dvijas are operating on the same ground. One point that Arvind made, how come that thousands of global university educated Brahmin Banya Kayastha intellectuals did not write a book on Dalit or Shudra ever till they wrote on their own self? How do you explain this? What is that consciousness? Where did it come from? Lack of interaction with nature, production, and lack of idea of God as a creator of human equal. That destroyed. And the point today is BJP, RSS want to take Shudras, Dalits, Adivasis back to medieval and Vedic period. And at least we have to tell Shudras, don't allow this fight. Fight with all the strength that you have. You have been stupid all these years. You cannot remain stupid with this few seven. And they deceived them in English education. They went to Oxford, Harvard, Cambridge, and came back and said anti-colonial nonsense. They read 10 books and wrote 11th book out of that, called great scholarship. I know what Romila Thapar wrote. I know what these people have written, what Ramchandra Guha is writing today. So the question is not that. The question is, how do Shudras realize that they don't have their own philosophy? Dalits have a philosophy. They are Buddhists, they are Christians. Therefore, this idea has to be put, and all of us. The one more point I'll make is there was a school called agriculturalism in China in 7th century BC. And the Chinese agriculturalist philosophy, it is not production based, philosophy put farmer higher than priest. What happened in India? Why did we become poor? Why did we lose ground to China today? So that has to be brought back. I request if Ram Shepherd is there to quickly answer the question of myth that Ajay wrote, because Ram has contributed a brilliant piece in this book on the history of myth and mythology. Ram, can you do it?
Could you raise your hand if you can hear Mr. Ram?
Ram Shepherd, are you there?
No. Sir
Okay.
is not there.
Okay. Manikant, can you just briefly say what you want to say about the Shudra Dalit conflict that both Ajay and Professor Thorat were raising?
Yeah.
If you can also use your videos.
Yeah. So good evening, everyone, and like Professor Thorat and Professor Ajay sir. Yeah. So I mean, thanks for all your suggestions on this and how to sort of go ahead in taking forward the study of the Shudra. So in a sense, I'll just start with this question of what Professor Thorat have said, that we have to sort of focus on where the OBCs or the Shudras lack. We should not ask the question what they have and then ponder upon that analysis. So I think this book, sir, exactly does that. And we say, and I have this piece on Shudra consciousness, and wherein comes across the all chapters that the Shudras or the OBCs lack in that consciousness which Professor Gudavarti which Ajay sir was talking about, the having a new normative universalism. So I think this is what the book is, very strongly sort of suggesting in creating that sort of counter public. So quickly, mentioning about the contradiction and contradiction part, which also sort of have to be understood. Yes, I agree that it has to be sort of dealt in more with the internal power dynamics, or we should have a more sort of tools of the new social theories. But given that, how do we understand that social theories in India? In a Brahminical modernity or in a Brahminical nationalist construct. So this, I think, Professor G. Aloysius sir and many others have written on understanding the essence of social theories in a Brahminical modernity. So I think we always forget somehow in the mainstream academia, we forget about the essence of what Phule and also what Dr. Ambedkar has talked about, the Shudra, the contradiction. So for example, Jyotiba Phule's introduction to the Gulamgiri clearly mentions about this contradiction or this creation of contradictions that the Brahmins have created. For example, he brings in the case of the Malis, the shepherd and the peasant caste. He says that these three castes are initially they dependent on the farming, and then later on with the intervention of a Brahmin priest, these three castes have become a separate caste, and then and there has been a the intermarriage between them has been prohibited. So this also gives, and then he goes on saying that I mean, this happens because of a lack of ignorance or this lack of consciousness, where one shrewd Brahmin or the Shedji Bhatji brings in this conflict. So I think when we want to have social theories, new social theories, in order to understand this conflict, we should also have a sort of we should also sort of deconstruct the social history as well. So I think this also has to come in through the empirical data. I think this we have done in the last chapter of Caste and Political Economy, which is written by a Shudra team, wherein we brought the data that you have suggested, who is poor, who is rich, who has what, who lacks what, all this, I mean, we have brought in, and then sort of we try to establish. So I think this contradiction, yes, there is this still, this contradictions which we have to sort of deal with. But I think if we have a sort of Shudra consciousness that is which is a new normative, which makes new normative universalism appeal, I think then there will be a space for dialogue, which both Phule and Dr. Ambedkar were insisting, and then we can sort of destroy the Chaturvarna, which Dr. Ambedkar in his Who Were the Shudras, he believed that only the Shudra Varna can, it has all the strongest capability and capacity to destroy the this fourfold Chaturvarna. And the last quick point, sir, I just want to sort of bring in about the sacred literature, or this link between the philosophy and the consciousness, is that the Brahmins, the entire sacred literature in producing or in normalizing that philosophy, Dr. Ambedkar again very sort of brilliantly puts in Who Were the Shudras. He says that what is this sacred literature? This sacred literature is nothing but a creation of the Brahmins. So I think this is what should be an important thing for us when we sort of understand, or when we want to create a sort of counter public or alternative symbols, or that counter hegemonic project, or also when we sort of want to draft or disseminate new social theories, we have to understand this essence of philosophy, this essence of consciousness. I think this is what in a way this book places in, and this is what it says, that the Shudras and the OBCs lack a consciousness and also few material things that they are thinking that they still have, but in a sense they really don't have in a broader moral and spiritual manner. So I think with this few words, I'll thank you one and all. Thank you, sir.
Professor Kancha, your mic is muted.
Yes.
No. For that
Yes.
comment. That other point that I was making, that these Shudras are in agriculture. If they come to, let us say, universities, priesthood, and they come into all other major businesses, which is related to whether agriculturists should become industrialists or industrialists should become agriculturists tomorrow or not, as Thorat was saying. My view is that once the Shudras ask for spiritual equality in temple system, overcoming the Agama Shastra ideology, because non-Hindutva intellectuals, all of them, are writing dozens of books about Hindu majoritarianism. Imagine if there are no Shudras in that, there is no Hindu majoritarianism. The Muslims don't have to be afraid then. But if they are there, if they start a movement against Brahmins, that we would like to be priests in the temples, we would like to be priests in Tirupati, in Ram temple, if Yadavs tomorrow say that Krishna temple is ours, we will run the temple, we will read the Bhagavad Gita as a textbook, then a new movement starts. And RSS whole cultural nationalism will collapse. The whole control of RSS, the way it reached, Ambedkar never imagined that RSS BJP would come to this level. Therefore, we are now working on areas where, okay, if you give the rights, let it be. You declare, I have asked several times, let Mohan Bhagavat declare that Hindu God created all Hindus equal. Then the right to theological study, the right to Geneva, whether it should be or it should not be. Then why not they just think of doing agriculture? The RSS worked out the anti-reservation school of thought. There is no single Shudra in that, not Gujar, Patel, Jat, even at that time in 90s. It is these Idrijas. But why not they coming to tilling of the land if they have merit? Because lack of their meritorious work on the field, Indian agriculture, let them produce crops, better crops. Let them compete with China. So Ajay, why should not you think on those lines and work a text? What has Brahmanism done to you? Because I have seen many whites writing books, what whiteness has done to me. Why not Ajay write a book, what Brahmanism has done to me? Then how you were disconnected with production, you were disconnected with mud, and after all, mud is the source of food. As a child, you were disconnected, as an adult, you were disconnected, and all generations were disconnected. So, writing of a philosophy for change and revolution is not only the victim's duty. And all Indian universities, central universities, IITs, Oxford educated, Harvard educated, miserably failed here. That is what Brahmanism is. Therefore, we want to overcome that and see that Shudra thinkers come out in numbers to their level of population and challenge. Then see what happens to knowledge, how Hinduism is reformed. Okay, let them be Hindu, I have no problem. But they should be equal as Hindus. Then Brahmin, Banya, Kayastha, Khatri could also till the land, produce agricultural food, and lift the garbage. Why not? Why should they only be priests, professors, thinkers, writers, politicians, clerks, or what so? So that is what this cycle of change in philosophical domain. And why not they read mantra in English? Why only in Sanskrit? That was the norm for Christianity in Greek and Latin before Martin Luther came. And Islam suffers with Arabic now. So therefore, these are questions we are raising for universal revalidation of religion from Indian soil. You must remember as a last point, if the Shudras bring about a revolution here in Hinduism or go out of it, the whole world will be a different place. The whole world, not just India. That was the ultimate objective of an idea. And this book is just an opening statement. And I think thousands of books should be written about the whole Shudra history and culture and future and so on.
Thank you, Professor Shefford. Very important and very, you provided such a guiding light. And certainly we would want to be in that situation where the world is not like this. So thank you for exhorting all of us. And Professor Thorat, if you may permit, I would like to read out the some comments and questions that have come here and also on.
Please do. I'll make a last comment finally.
Yes. So would you like to go right now or after the
No, at the end.
Okay, sir. Okay. Thank you so much.
So if there are questions to me, please direct to me. I'll answer them.
Yes, I will do so. So actually, this is to all panelists. The names to the panelists have not been written by most of the questioners. So feel free to pitch in when you would like to. So I'll just begin with a few comments. One is by Professor Vishwanath Kalaiya. He says that most of the posts in the context of Karnataka, most of the CM posts are from the Shudras. Most of the agricultural lands are owned by Shudras. No social and economic reforms are there. Most of the educational institutions are owned by the Shudras in Karnataka, but only 2 dominant castes own them. So we need a detailed and very clinical analysis of the Shudras' socioeconomic past and present. And also there is an anonymous attendee who says that we need to have a cognitive intervention periodically. He or she agrees with Dr. Ajay Gudavarti when he says that more empirically grounded and robust sociological theory is needed that has not produced cognitive break in the academia. So, and then there are a few questions, and this is coming straight from the heart, I believe, is that one of the scholars or attending the lecture is that she or he attends law school, and a lot of her Dvija Savarna professors justify the caste-based professions by saying that it is okay since because of their expertise, and then they say reservation has been in India for a long period of time. So when law schools are supposed to teach Baba Saheb and his thoughts, they perpetuate casteism and leave the lawyers being bigots. What do we do in this? There's, if you could reconcile this for her or him. And then closely related to this is, so shouldn't we just get rid of the caste system as advocated by Baba Saheb? No one should know what caste the other belongs. Everyone should be treated on the basis of merit and need. We can't be piggybacking on histories of discrimination. With this caste system, how will we move towards a radical egalitarian justice? So this has been lingering in the minds of many young scholars, I believe. One question from Facebook Live is that by Tejas Suresh ji. He very much likes the chapter by Vinay Kumar sir. He exhorts that there needs to be a little updation of facts and shed more light on how a formidable unified Shudra formation. In fact, Professor Thorat and Professor Kancha Ilaiah also mentioned about the unifying nature of Shudras that benefits our communities, whether it is in the economic sense and in the chapter by Bindu ma'am, where she speaks about the lack of cultural capital amongst the dominant communities, even though they have exhibited the political mobility. So there are other detailed chapters, and the person, Mr. Tejas, has read the book in detail. Thank you for that. And he says that there is a lot of appropriation of Shudra art forms, and the Shudra situation is geography dependent. For example, in the South, due to the progressive movements like the Dravidian movement, there have been marked improvements in the lives of Shudras. And so if we could have a separate chapter on the same. So, and given the socioeconomic gains made by certain Shudra communities, there is hope, and we hope that this hope can be, expanded. There is another question by Shiva Priya, madam, who says that many a times the discrimination is based on birth. Even if an OBC has education, job, better living conditions, they cannot escape the caste identity. What will be the solution for this? And I think she thinks that it will only happen when the psyche of everyone, including those from the upper caste, changes. And then it will be an impossible, it may not be an impossible dream to achieve. So also, sir, I would like to point out to a few question on the chat here about by Praveen Vidyarthi, sir. He says that as Baba Saheb Ambedkar said, education is the key to change the status of Shudras, but no one is talking to flourishing his ideas or expanding his ideas by supporting the eligible and valuable students for their higher education. There is no single scholarship which supports this idea. So the students from the community, so Shudra community, can get out of this confined education system in India and learn from the world-renowned education system. Also, if we could have more, I think there is a question that honorable panelists, I think there's a lot of disunity among Shudras. What do you think? Unfortunately, the book does not talk about the role of Shudra women Is this again an attempt to make women face the double whammy of patriarchy? And similar questions from Telangana and Andhra Pradesh context. The Reddis, Velumas, Khamas in Shudra communities, it is not justifiable in the present context. They are forced to oppose the development of the Shudras, and then they violate the rights of the real Shudras. So if you could respond to some of these, it would be very interesting to see your take. Professor Kancha Ilaiah first.
Yeah, well, Simi, do you find Bindu there on the screen? Bindu is online, is the author of the Karnataka chapter.
She was there, but she's not there anymore.
Okay. Unfortunately, Prachi is not there, who has written. Now, Karthik, would you like to quickly respond to some of these issues?
First, I start with the last question, like as to there is no woman participation in this, or there is no women issues just discussed in this volume, because two scholars exactly do that, Prachi Patel and Bindu. They talk about the question of women and they discuss that question. And other thing I would like to discuss is that in the lack of data, and we certainly agree there is a lack of data in terms of when we are studying this much populous kind of a Shudra population, which is like 10% population of the whole world. So here the point to note is that why there is the lack of such data even after this long. So even when we read about academics writing during Mandal times, so their prime concern is that there is no credible data available. So on that basis, they were rejecting the policies like Mandal Commission reports. So while they were quick to reject the reports, still we are in the same situation where there is a lack of such credible data. So, and like Thorat sir said, like and everyone would agree that a social education, a socially oriented education, and ideologically informed education is lacking among the Shudra masses, which enables them, gives the power of modern research tools to find out their own status. So the academic establishment has systematically failed them in terms of providing their data, the status. And one great example is that the even recent caste census is being withheld, and no Shudras, or though they are politically powerful in regional areas, are not able to wrestle that report from the center. And so this lack of data is a problem, as well as is also a product of the problem that the caste structure we have. So with that, I'll pass to
Arvind, which author is available apart from Arvind?
Mr. Manikanta is here.
No, Manikanta he spoke. Arvind, can you respond to some of the questions?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
Sir, please go on.
Okay. One question I thought, because I made a presentation after Ajay sir, but despite that, because I couldn't capture that, because I wanted to sum this up, because Professor Thorat was also there to speak after me. So one point when he says that Sudras makes the backbone of Hindutva today, and how does one imagine of a broader unity of the Sudras, there I would argue on ideological frame that Professor Ilaiah and Professor Thorat both said, that no oppressed imitates their oppressor. If you go to United States of America, the blacks never imitated whites. they in fact built their own ideology of protest saying, we are black and black is beautiful. In the Indian context, Dalit, as Professor Ilaiah rightly suggested, they built their own philosophy and then says, okay, fine. Obviously, there were temple entry movement, but a lot of Dalits also realized that we do not need necessarily to enter temple. And in protest, they converted to Buddhism, or many converted to Christianity. It is the only oppressed caste, and as castes, a group of castes rather, and as Professor Thorat rightly suggested, that Ambedkar long ago, in 1916, he also, like Professor Thorat, Ambedkar also was primarily a student of economics. But look at his 1916 essay on the genesis of caste and mechanism. He so brilliantly explains the graded inequality, and this is the panacea. And the lot of Sudra castes, instead of making a protest against the Brahmins or the Brahminical system, they started imitating them. So there is the problem I see. So unless the Sudras started recognizing, like the blacks did in the United States and the Dalits did in India, they will have to realize and will assert that, yes, I'm a Sudra. Yes, I have never been allowed to go to a school. Yes, I have, your Manu Smriti always told that if I start listening to your Vedas, lead must be, hot lead must be, put into my ears. So definitely, I agree. And Professor Thorat brought in very enlightening points, which are, learning for we young scholars. But the one question Simi just told. One question that one of the audience asked, that Dr. Ambedkar wanted annihilation of caste, but we are actually getting trapped into the consolidation of caste. So how will we find the egalitarian society? And, nothing would have been better that the so-called the Dvija caste would change their mind. Gandhi for long years kept on suggesting that there will be a change of heart, but that heart never changed. So I think the Sudras of this nation will have to use this double-edged weapon, as Professor Ilaiah said. One, that the spiritual equality, that if you want to keep us Hindu, if you want to keep us in the Hindu framework, give us our rights. Give us 52% of every rights in the universities, in the judiciary, political system. Yes, Professor, I agree with Professor Thorat when he says, that politically also they have been dominant because of the numerical thing. But that is only on regional basis. In Karnataka, in Maharashtra, he rightly said, even in Bihar for last 30 years, either you have Nitish or Lalu. I absolutely get the point. But then on an ideological point, sir, you would agree that we have a home minister, junior home minister, who is a Yadav Pai caste, Nityanand Rai from Bihar. But he is the one who's, in Rajya Sabha, while answering to the caste census, says that we cannot have caste census. So there are Sudras who actually have fallen trapped into the Hindutva school. But then the purpose of this very book is to, and therefore this I argue that this book has two dual purpose. One is that an argument begins inside academic circles. So in the university also they will bring this book into the the bibliography, into the reading list, that we do not have any book on Sudras except for Ambedkar's who were the Sudra, and Sarat Patil's Dasa Sudra slavery, or maybe Mahatma Phule slavery. Even JNU does not teach. I as a student never got to know about slavery when I was a MA student, because it was not there in the curriculum. So my point is, this book has dual purpose. One, that it will initiate debate in the university. So those educated Sudras who will get into the higher education will reflect upon themselves. This book will help. And second, this book has a purpose of making a social movement. So the grassroots workers, the organizations, the NGOs will have to take this book and go into a campaign that took 10 Hindus. If you do, this will not help. By wearing Janeu, you have not become Kshatriya. This is the final point that I'm making, that no Sudras in this country, by imitating the Brahminical, the models of wearing a sacred thread, has become Kshatriya. They have remained Sudras. So at ideological level, at a philosophical level, and at spiritual level, they will have to realize that, yes, I am a Sudra and I must be with this identity and assert, forward from that point. Thank you. These are the few points that I wanted to add.
Yeah, Simi,
Yes,
Om
sir.
Prakash is there.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Om
Yes, sir.
Prakash wants to respond to one or two questions.
Yes. Thank you, sir. Mr. Om Prakash, over to you.
So please unmute yourself.
And if you can come on video, Mr. Om Prakash.
Okay. Please unmute yourself, Om Prakash.
Om Prakash, sir.
Still on mute.
He's not coming?
No, he is there, but are you able to hear us, sir?
Okay. Okay. Can you ask Manikan to briefly respond to questions, and then maybe you can give the scope to Professor Thorat?
Yes,
Right.
yes. Manikanta, sir, over to you. Yeah, Mr. Om Prakash says he is having some problem with his audio.
Okay, fine.
Manikanta, sir.
Yeah, I think I think one question think Tejas Suresh has posted in Facebook, I guess it's on my chapters on that Nobel Prize thing. Yeah, I mean, no, the only thing is to just mention about a larger perspective, as in why there isn't a much sort of philosophical contribution from the this sort of larger productive caste who is sort of engaged with nature and other sort of things, why they are not into in a larger positions that equal to the other three varnas. So basically, I think one point consistently that has been missed in the discussion is that uh, it's the Dvijas versus the Shudras, or the Brahmin Baniya hegemony versus the Shudras, on par with what Jyotiba Phule has sort of created that entire dichotomous structure. Not created, but as in he sort of placing that entire philosophical and political manifestations in that dichotomy structure, Shetji, Bhatji versus Shudra and Ati Shudra. So this book, in a way, it does the same thing, that placing the Hindutva Dvija versus the Shudra. So I think in that perspective, if one looks at these questions, I think that there will be sort of uh, answers to it. And Rajaratna ji sort of asked about, I just saw these questions, so much everywhere, like caste system, why? Now that's what we are exactly asking all the Dalits or the Adivasis, or the reserved Shudras, unreserved Shudras, OBCs. We are also asking the same question, why it is everywhere, this casteism. So I think still, if we look at, so this is the problem with us, right? In this country, whenever this caste speaks about, the caste, or this the issues of philosophy, then immediately people come and say that no, look, this is the casteism. Whereas when Narendra Modi, or when Mohan Bhagavat, or many others, when they talk about the caste, they openly endorse their Kshatriya identity. they openly say that, I mean, the Hindu women should produce more children in order to, I mean, sort of save this Hindu nation. Then, I mean, more liberals, or I mean, nobody will question. So I think that understanding has to be sort of inverted in that sense. And Shivapriyaji's question of yes, I mean, it is still the same there. I mean, the OBCs in education, in job. I think the recent RTIs are showing us that nowhere in the public education system, I mean, there is the equal representation for the OBCs. So I think that what Professor Thorat has suggested, we have to take that very seriously, and then I think through those means we have to start this fight, or we have to continue this fight. I think I'll just stop here. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, Simi, Om
Yes, sir.
Prakash seems to have come. Just ask him to.
Yes, sir. Om Prakash, sir, are you there? Will you be able to turn?
Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Please
Yes.
continue.
So regarding this Shudra and the caste question, so like there is a friend of us, like Rahul Sombimble. So he says caste is never a a Bahujan issue, a Dalit issue. Caste has always been the issue of Sabarnas, and it is them like who want to retain the caste system. So like at one it says like you can say like that so there has been like this debate on identity. So who does the identity politics? So it is not that we do identity politics to retain the identity. It is we do identity politics to do anti-caste politics. So we are against the caste system. So it's like no one-way process, no? Like so even there was a talk in CPS, and Professor Godavarti sir is well, like he was one member of the talk, where like our teacher, like Professor Eminent Thakur, he said like that identity politics is kind of like it have blocked this Ambedkar movement. So because of identity politics, there has been like this thing. It has blocked the universal politics. So the upper class understanding of identity politics is this, that like that we are not universal. But how can like Ambedkarism be not universal, and how come Gandhism be universal? So there is a question. So when
answer.
Hello.
Yes, sir.
Hello.
Please continue.
Yeah.
Please continue.
Yes. So some background noise was there. So yes. So I'm saying like, so when we juxtapose like one in front of another, then there is always this problem. So Gandhi becomes universal, but Ambedkar is not universal again for the upper caste and the upper caste scholars. So like since we are not there in this like in the entire academia, it becomes easy for a Savarna, the Dvija caste that Professor Kancha Ilaiah says, to like
Om Prakash, sir, you just went on mute somehow.
Hello.
Yes. You were saying Professor Kancha Ilaiah said.
That the Dvija caste, like how they have manipulated the entire system, and how they have put up like the Shudras outside. So when like this is a confrontation between like the Shudras and the Dvijas. The Dvijas want to retain the caste system everywhere, like not only in academic institutions, right from judiciary to politics to everywhere. So this is where it becomes necessary to have a vision, to give a vision for this for the like the masses, the Shudras that govern 52% of the population. And this is where like Sardar says like that even like recent the political parties, especially the RJDs, the BSP and the other political parties, they have become leaders of their own caste. So we have to break this thing, like the leaders that doesn't become the leader of their own caste, because there is a huge mass like expecting a lot from the leaders, especially who are governing us, who are leading us. So and like I'm like I was like I was with Sarja's point that like the today's leaders have become the leaders of their own caste and not talking about the larger, like, the horizontal solidarity that Shudra can have, so that we can counter this, like, RSS and BJP regime at present. Yeah, this is what I wanted to, like, say about this, the prevailing, like, Shudras and this Dvijas caste. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Can we go to Dr. Ajay Gudavarti for briefly responding to or any other points that you'd like to make quickly, sir?
I'll ask Professor Thorat, maybe after Professor Thorat.
No. Thorat will have a final as a chairman.
Yes, so that's welcome. That you should have the final word. No, I think this was a very fascinating.
So that nobody question me.
Yes. So I think this was really a fascinating debate, and we see two kinds of methodologies really emerging, while Professor Thorat is asking us to see the material basis for thought, for caste and caste consciousness. I think Professor Ilaiah is looking at the more philosophical and the spiritual basis. I think Brahmanism has really done this trick of juxtaposing one against the other, that how do we really combine the material with the philosophical. I think we cannot merely do with the philosophical spiritual without looking at material, because there are concrete issues, for instance, in the countryside and hinterland, that it is the Shudra caste which are responsible for much of oppression of Dalits, of violence. What do we do with that? I mean, there's a concrete question. I think there we might have certain limitations of the philosophical and spiritual turn, that how do we create that consciousness? How do we create that self-critique? I think it demands a lot in terms of that spiritual fascism that Professor Ilaiah is talking. Maybe we'll have to also talk about spiritual liberation of Shudras from their own position. I mean, that produces, that's where I think Professor Thorat's point lends a lot of clarity in terms of why they act the way they do, and why this movement towards Hindutva is not merely about ignorance and lack of awareness, but it is a certain kind of group interest because of their specific location within caste system. While Prof. Ilaiah is asking for an overall of a cultural revolution kind of an idea, which is, I think, also very useful. We'll have to go beyond these caste locations to think of a new philosophy. That's where I think this critique of Brahmanism, that is idea that Brahmins need to also be self-critical. I will only conclude by what Bal Gopal once wrote. I'm quite fond of this formulation of Bal Gopal, and I think Professor Ilaiah would know that. He said that critiquing oppression by anyone, a critique of oppression by anyone would invariably involve a critique of a certain part of our own selves. I think all of us have certain positionalities, whether if it's a Dalit, it could be a Dalit man. If it is OBC, it could be male. It could be, as we said, lower end OBC. So I think a part of our own. But the key question would be in this, what Professor Thorat said, graded inequality. How do we produce this universal ethic of a self-critique? I think it's not very easy because we are so varied in our social and material location. That's where I think the spiritual liberation that Professor Ilaiah talks about has to offer this universal ethic, that along with critiquing what is lacking, a self-critique also has to be added to that if we are to move away from fascism. I see somewhere that ethic of missing self-critique, I think, is a constitutive of Brahmanism. So beginning from Brahmins downwards, but how do we produce it as a universal ethic when we have such social and material gradations, I think is a question beyond me, at least now, as of now. And I would now, I think, give it to Professor Thorat for the last word.
But Simi, yes, Akash Singh Rathore would like to say something. Professor.
Sir, actually he had to go, so
okay, fine then.
Yes, sir, I would invite you to share your views, the final concluding views. In fact, and then we'll go to Professor Thorat.
Me?
Yes, sir, you.
Well, this volume is only a beginning of the Shudra ideological agenda, be it of spiritual, be it of political, be it of economic, because this social mass remained unintellectual, though there are regional colleges, regional universities, but how do we explain their absence in central universities, in high-end writing, in all top newspapers, in TV channels, everywhere? And what is the share of Shudra? You know, we were just looking at one data, though I'm not very fond of database analysis. All Shudra non-reserved castes put together would be 3 times more than the Dvijas. Jat, Gujar, Patel, Maratha, Kamma, Reddy, Nair, Lingayat, Vaklinga, so on. But when you see their percentage in central services, they are not even 5 to 6%. That is the level of their national knowledge, their regional force. So the book wants them to become national. So organize themselves as Shudras at Delhi and take over Congress or even take over BJP. Don't remain and take over temples. And then the battle within Dvijas and Shudras will start. Dalits, I don't know. Right now, even RSS, BJP don't think that they'll be hugely part of Hinduism. And all these scholars, when they write Hindu majoritarianism, I don't think they are including Dalits. They are mainly including Shudras and Dvija castes. So we would like to take them away from the feet of that god or capture the head itself, head of the god, philosophically. Once you capture the head of the god, the Brahmin, Banya, Kayastha, Khatris have no way but to get into every profession because they can't remain in central universities. They can't remain in Delhi for all the time. So this is what the Bengali Brahminism has done through communism. They are world over, but they don't talk about caste. Now Narendra Modi and Amit Shah, unfortunately, had to teach them caste. This is the tragedy of Brahminism, no? So we just put this book as a first token by involving very young kids because the senior people were not even willing to identify. The situation of Shudra identity is much worse than the Dalit identity in 1990. Today, look at the tragedy. So how does this work? We'll have to be left to the future, but certainly the battle has started.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your views, and certainly the battle has started. Now, I would like to invite Professor Thorat for his concluding remarks, and kindly, if you could also accommodate a comment by Mr. Praveen Vidyarthi, who wishes to have an answer as Baba Sahib Ambedkar said, education is key to changing the status of the Shudras, but no one is talking to flourishing his ideas by supporting the eligible and valuable students for their higher education. There is no single scholarship which supports this idea. And so the students from the Shudra community can get out of this confined education system in India and also learn from the world-renowned education system. So if you could take this and your concluding remarks, sir. Over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. The first point I would like to mention is that I have been a beneficiary of this discussion. I have understood the issues now in a much better way, so that I can respond it through my writing in later time. As far as I'll take the other issue later, but then you have mentioned the issue of education. I personally, in my writing, I have written a number of papers on higher education and access to education and education attainment. Some of those who are interested should read 2 volumes, the Higher Education and Equity by NUPA, National Educational Planning, Educational University for Education Planning and Administration. by Center of Higher Education. There I have pointed out the inequality in the attainment of higher education. And what one get again is the picture of graded hierarchy. The most illiterate are tribal, then followed by scheduled caste, then followed by OBC, and the highest is the high caste. I'm not talking of religious minorities. So scheduled higher caste, but they are ahead of scheduled caste. They are ahead of scheduled tribe. And there are some specific problem of educational problem of OBC which need to understand. And therefore, it is in this context I highlighted the problem of OBC in higher education. And I was the chairman of UGC, and Mungekar was a member of the Planning Commission. And Arjun Singh initiated the reservation policy for OBC. And the initial obstacle were overcome. He formed a committee to implement it quickly. And he made me and Mungekar a member, along with Milia as a chairman. He had a confidence that Thorat and Mungekar will solve the issue immediately. We solved it. We saw to it that the reservation for OBC is implemented in central universities. And Arjun Singh had asked me, what is the solution? There is a lot of opposition. I suggested him that there is only one solution. That if the high caste feel that 27% of their seat will go away or faculty position will go away at assistant professor level, give an additional position of 27% to seat to the higher caste. So the opposition will mellow down, and that is what precisely he has done. So I think as far as the commitment is concerned, nobody should raise objection against Dalit. The commitment for the reservation for the OBC is the highest from the side of Dalit. That you must remember that. And we should continue to fight. Yeah. Now let me come to the issues that are raised, because now I understand in a somewhat better way. Well, when I refer to data, I refer to the data with a concern, with a concern and concern for the OBCs. That if you highlight the problem which are not the problem, then your argument will not be accepted. But if you highlight the problem of OBC which are the problem, then I think that will be understood and policy can be developed. Now, on and often, people have talked about underrepresentation. Kancha Ilaiah has given the data. So he's making use of data to make the point, in fact. So we need a data that where our OBCs are underrepresented, there we should ask for a reservation. If they are lacking in industry, if they are lacking in certain position, Central University Vice Chancellor, they are lacking in some other field, their underrepresentation should be overcome. They should get a 50% share. But where they are overrepresented, where they are not underrepresented, for example, cultivators, the share of the OBC in cultivation is in proportion to their population, if you take the recent National Land Holding Survey. So demand for land ownership will not be sustainable. It will be sustainable for those OBC who are landless, whose proportion is less. So unless you have an empirical and database, the argument for the representation, adequate representation in proportion to the population won't be sustained. So please consider that. So when I said empirical data, I talk in a positive sense, not to refute the argument. The second use of data, I said in politics, that if you are saying that they are not power politics, they don't have share, then there is a political data. We should be used that where they are underrepresented, as rightly pointed out by Kancha Ilaiah, there is no prime minister so far, no president perhaps so far. But also we should accept that in all the states, the political power is in the hand of Shudras for so many years. So there cannot be a demand of that they are underrepresented. They may be underrepresented in politics in some other sphere. So we should ask for that. So you have to I address to the new generation of authors, just to tell that don't carried away by the myth and ideas. Ideas are important, but supplement ideas with data also, so that your argument will be practicable, it will be acceptable. That is very, very important. When I said the third issue is ideology, I clearly mentioned about that. The Shudras have been in the forefront against the Brahmanism, against the caste system, against the Hinduism. But that phase is gone. That was over before the independence. Thereafter, there are no strong movement among Shudras against the caste system and against Brahmins. But there are groups. In Maharashtra, many OBCs have converted to Buddhism. There are very ferocious writers, more ferocious than Kancha Ilaiah, Mr. Solunke. They are writing in Marathi against Brahmanism. There are attacks on them. Narendra Dabholkar has been, has been shut down because of his anti-Brahmanical views. So there are Shudra which are still working, but they are in minority. The major voice is somewhere else. That is one point. But the important point that I want to submit before all of you is this. I am getting little confused. It seems to me that you are talking less of Shudra representation, Shudra discrimination. There are no studies on discrimination in the public sphere and in employment and here there. There are more studies are necessary. There is hardly any study on discrimination of OBC in employment, in wages, in industry, in agriculture. So there are studies which are necessary before we talk about discrimination, but there is a discrimination. So we must talk about discrimination of OBC and bring it out. But I see, I do not know, Kancha Ilaiah should, after the seminar is over, we can talk about it. It seems to me that you are talking more about the Shudra consciousness, which I believe is not in tune with Dr. Ambedkar. If I am correct in understanding, I may be completely wrong. Dr. Ambedkar never talked about the untouchable consciousness, untouchable caste as a developing a consciousness in the caste and taking the pride. No. Dr. Ambedkar's consciousness was promoting values of equality, promoting values of liberty, fraternity, and brotherhood. That is the consciousness that he talked about. That is the consciousness he brought in preamble and in the Constitution. Not, he didn't talk about equality in the Constitution alone. He talked about non-discrimination. Non-discrimination against caste, race, gender, and all that. He talked against untouchability. So when he is talking about Hindu society being consciously changing, is to create a consciousness in favor of equality and fraternity and brotherhood and equality. What I have seen among Shudras in Maharashtra, I'm not talking of Andhra or Telangana, is the Shudra consciousness, the Maratha consciousness, the Jat consciousness. You have to see, you have seen the demonstration that are raised by the Marathas. The demonstration is one part of it, but the consciousness you had to see the consciousness that was expressed, caste consciousness. This was not a consciousness against casteism, against inequality, against the lack of freedom. So I am just making you aware. I could be completely wrong in understanding you, but if you are going by who were Shudras by Dr. Ambedkar, there is a chapter, third chapter, Brahmanical theories of Shudra. Shudra status in the caste system. There, that analysis has to be taken. I have not seen Ambedkar analysis in the discussion here. We are talking of spiritualism, but we have to talk of Brahmanism as an ideology. We cannot talk spiritualism in vague. And Brahmanism and an ideology which Dr. Ambedkar, nobody has examined as much as he has examined. It has two components. One is the religious ideology, that there is a faith in the God, that the people should pray the God, that they should perform ritual and sacrifice. Then the Brahmin priest would be the intermediary between the people and the God. And then there is a theory of karma, theory of rebirth, theory of soul. This is the entire stock of religious thought of Brahmanism. Then there is a social ideology of caste system. And both social ideology and religious ideology, both are oriented primarily by material interest. If there is expansion of temple today, that benefit Brahmins, because there are large number of priests, large number of, if you develop faith in the people that you should go and pray in the temple, there are large number of visitors, large number of fees and donations. So Dr. Ambedkar ultimately in that chapter that the caste system and Hindu religious ideology has a material base, and that material base affects Shudras because they are denied right to education, they were denied right to property, they are denied right to religious equality. So I think I do not see in this discussion the Brahmanism, the opposition to the Brahmanism by Shudra in his religious ideas and in social ideas. Vaguely talking is not enough. Please, Ambedkar pointedly attacked the Brahmanical ideology. Vedism, Vedic Brahmanism, Neo-Brahmanism, Reform Brahmanism, which is detrimental to Shudra, which is detrimental to the Dalit, but which is also detrimental to India as a whole, to build up as a nation, to build up as a democracy. Ambedkar talk of majoritarianism in terms of Hinduism, in communal deadlock and way to solve it. He talk about majoritarianism in terms of caste and in terms of religion. And he says that the Indian democracy will be a communal democracy and it will be a greater danger to the minority. Then it is a danger to the minority now, for social minority and religious minority. So please have a clarity on what kind of ideology, what kind of spiritual ideology. Spiritualism is a different concept. The Brahmanism is a clear concept. Vedic Brahmanism, Neo-Brahmanism, and all that is very clear. It has religious and social ideology, which harm Shudra, which are untouchable, which harm country. So you have to talk clearly about it. And so when you talk of Dalit Shudra consciousness, that is I don't mind that, because the mobilization in Indian society is originated in the caste. I don't mind that. But we cannot develop a caste consciousness to take a pride in that. So that will go against the very idea of consciousness of equality. The entire fight and struggle has to be on equality of individual, liberty of all, fraternity. That is the basis. It cannot be caste consciousness. It has to be the principle. The consciousness has to be around the principle of equality, fraternity, which will bring some benefit to the OBC, to the Shudras. The idea of discrimination has led to reservation for OBC. It was Dr. Ambedkar who in the Constitution we say that no, if you don't accept right now, at least have a provision for the setting up of a commission, which has resulted after several years into reservation. So idea of caste being discriminatory to the Shudras, that has to be brought out before we talk about representation. How discrimination lead to the underrepresentation of OBC. For that you require studies. Give me one example of a study where the discrimination of OBC has been studied in agriculture, in industry, in education. Detail you have to have it. Then we can make an argument. But without that, also we got OBC got reservation, but the OBC also need reservation in other sphere. But we have to justify. If we want to go to industry, how industry discrimination affect the Shudras. They don't get loan. The commodity produced by them won't be purchased by the Vaishya. The capital circulation and other things, cheat fund operate within the caste. So caste discrimination is very important. No, I would not like to go that. We certainly have a difference of opinion. I'm prepared to live with that. But I think it is a common struggle of Shudras and the Dalit. And it is quite likely that the upper Shudra may not join us because their problem doesn't exist. But lower Shudra, the OBC certainly have a common problem with the Dalit and others. So we have to join others, but there has to be an understanding that what are we talking about? What are we goal? What are our goal? What ideology is harmful to us? That has to be clear. To Kancha Ilaiah, it is clear. I know he has written about Brahmanism. He has written about Buddhism. He has talked about the Brahmanism and Buddhism struggle. But it has to be, when we talk of Shudra and talk of new youth writers, we have to place it in a clear manner. So these are I was saying it with a lot of concern and love, and that I would be a part of it. So please consider it positively. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Thorat. Wonderful listening to you. And yes, it is actually the exchange of differences of opinion and that we, in fact, have come throughout history that, to converging points. And I'm sure that every one of us have taken it in the positive spirit. So thank you so much. And I would like to propose the formal vote of thanks. If anybody would like to add or come in, if you would like to, or I can just go ahead and conclude, wrap up.
It's quite late. Yes, please.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And it was an honor listening to the great minds over here. I echo Professor Thorat's views that even I have been a beneficiary of this discussion. And I'm confident that all of us attending the program now over Zoom and Facebook Live, and also those who will watch later on YouTube, would also benefit immensely. So thank you, respected and great panelists, for being so generous with your time and gracing the event. Chairperson for the program, Professor Thorat, the book series editor, Professor Akash Singh Rathore, Professor Ajay Gudavarti, book editor, Professor Kancha Ilaiah Shepherd, Mr. Karthik, and all the book authors who were able to join us, Mr. Manikantha, Mr. Om Prakash, Ms. Sunil Sardar, Ms. Bindu, and all of the authors who couldn't join. I really would like to congratulate you and also thank all of you, especially Professor Shepherd and Mr. Karthik, for actually putting in all your efforts and bringing this wonderful scholarship to fruition. I would like to especially thank Dr. Arvind Kumar, who is also the author of the book, one of the authors in the book, for guiding this discussion, without whose efforts it wouldn't have been possible. And also Dr. Arjun Kumar, who was actually the last PhD student of Professor Thorat, and director of IMPRI.
Yeah, I didn't recognize him, but now I realize that.
Yeah, thank you, sir, for all your presence and all your guidance. Thank you so much. And it is actually your point of views, professors, your your fascinating views and bringing this entire book into fruition and scholarship, and also providing the way forward towards the Shudra revolution in present day India. It is very heartening to note from Professor Ilaiah himself that this book is just the beginning. And thank you for this promising and rich scholarship. And in complete solidarity, I wish you all the best and best of health and a very good night. Jai Bhim.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Good night.